What is going on, everybody? This is SCP CRNP, aka Lack of Lepers. Thank you so much for joining us on SCP Meta, our Twitch channel, where we do mostly something every day or night. Tonight is Friday, happy Friday, the 20th, and tonight is our gauntlet style, usually 3-hour long show, where we go through all of the SCP Wiki articles that made it to the Wiki successfully this week. We summarize these for you so that you can kind of condense all of that down into just a very short amount of time, relatively speaking. And then we talk a little bit about each article. I can't help but share how I feel. I talk too much. So we do that as well. Now, this week, as you know, is a very special week. Not in a good way. No. The SCP Wiki went down on Thursday morning, about 8 a.m. where I live, 8 a.m. CST. So that means we have a lot fewer articles this week than we typically would have available to us. And it also means that we will not be able to look at a lot of these articles that we'll still talk about as we're talking about them. Usually we have a very nice visual aid to help us out. So we do have a few of these articles that were captured in the Wayback Machine so that we should be able to look at them while we talk about them. But I think it's still a good idea to talk about the ones that we won't be able to see, just because that'll give this a little more replay value. You can go back and look at those articles that you can't right now, because at some point the wiki will come back up, I'm sure, and these articles will still be there, waiting for you to wonder if you should read them or not. So we'll do that. And I think the number of articles that we have this week is somewhere around 15 or something like that. It's a lot less than 13. It's a lot less than what we usually have. So we'll try to make the best of it. We'll see what we can do. I think we'll be able to fill the whole time. If not, we'll get out a little early. Class will be dismissed just a little bit early. So that's nice to hear. If we have some time, I may go into some other things that we didn't get to last week, because last week was quite a busy week. Okay, so having said that, let's dive right in. Let's see what we can do. I thankfully was pretty caught up with the SCP Wiki when it went down on Thursday. I think there were like 2 or 3 articles that I hadn't read yet that were up. So, you know, it'll be incomplete. We'll just have to sort of say sorry to those articles. Maybe I'll cover them next week if all goes well and the wiki is back up. So, but not every single one, unfortunately, will be there today. Okay, so let us begin. So this week of articles started on the 13th. So we are just right here. And luckily, these early ones, these first few, they actually were captured in the Wayback Machine. So we will use those to look at these articles. I want to thank you so much for joining, by the way. If you think that someone would be entertained by this, given that there's not a whole lot to do in the space right now, as there usually is, then feel free to share the link. And if you've read these and you have your own commentary on these, I'd be thrilled to hear what those are, whether it's agreeing or disagreeing or what have you. I think that would be great. So do not be shy. But let's go ahead and get into this. Let's see what we can do. So the first article this week was SCP ZH048. And I am kicking myself because I don't recall what ZH is. Maybe somebody can tell me. But anyway, so as you can see on this page, we have a pretty commercial image here. It almost looks like something that would be on a menu. It's got a nice little tilt effect to it. Kind of giving a little more intimacy to the perspective here, as we all know that effect does. And so it looks very clean. I think maybe a little too clean for something that the Foundation would take. But hey, that's just what we're dealing with here. So what is this? This is a beverage franchise with an anomalous humanoid that is designated -A that makes anomalous drinks to order behind the counter there. So let's take a quick peek what this looks like. So Yeah, it's pretty good clinical tone, I would say, for translation. Basically, we've got some pretty mundane, containment procedures, nothing special. The description is a franchise store of the beverage shop, and this is a literal shop in whatever country this is. I apologize. And then basically what happens is there's a menu, and it's a little different from your usual menu that you get in these stores. And the person behind the counter, the anomalous individual, will make items that typically wouldn't be seen in this chain restaurant. So it's a simple setup that lends itself well to testing logs. You've got this menu: potion of health restoration, potion of mana restoration, potion of divine blessing, full restoration, and resurrection. And so, of course, these, like I said, lend themselves very well to a testing log. That's kind of the obvious decision here. And so that's exactly what we get. So this is a collapsible here. The anomaly itself, I would say, is not terribly interesting, because the store itself is not really anomalous. It's really what happens in the store with the person behind the counter, designated A, and it's just a restaurant. So the anomaly actually gets a little more developed as you go through these testing logs, and what seems to happen is exactly what you might think when you're reading these names, which is that this potion of health restoration, basically subjects who consumed the potion exhibited different extents of self-regeneration. Damaged cells were able to rebuild themselves at a rate that was noticeable to the naked eye, yada, yada, yada. Same thing with mana restoration. They have been observed to emit more Eve radiation than what is standard. I think that's a very clever use of Eve to kind of stand in for mana, MP points, essentially. So if you haven't picked up yet, and as you go through these testing logs, you basically get the idea that these are the kinds of potions that you would see in a video game, RPG of some kind, where you go behind the counter and you buy some health potions, or you're running low on your magic, your MP, and so you get a potion for that. Very Final Fantasy-esque, very RPG-esque. And that's really what all of these testing logs say. Very, very verbatim, very straight. There's really no, except for this little Eve radiation bit, there's really no play with that concept. It's sort of copied and pasted right into the testing logs here, just as you would expect. There's really no finesse in these the treatment that this concept is given in these testing logs. And we do have some uninspired data redacteds and this insufficient clearance thing, which is sort of the same thing. So you really start to understand what this anomaly is by this first collapsible in the experiment. So it does a good job in that regard as testing logs, really sort of filling out, what exactly is going on here, what exactly is anomalous about this. So this is kind of like the franchise version of SCP-294, the coffee vending machine, with just some kind of new age flavors going on here. You may add the additional ingredients: salted plum, pickled plum, boboa, pearl. I don't know what QQ is. Sounds conspiratorial. Honey, wax gourd, plum jelly, yada, yada, yada. Aloe, all this kind of stuff. So it's very interesting. But so the effects are essentially video game RPG effects. The article seems to believe its interest lies in how these different drinks resemble tastes of teas. And so this was something included in here that really kind of threw me for a loop. I do understand from a scientific standpoint you would want to maybe document how something tastes, but the result of every single one of these sections always starts out the same way. The flavor was described as blank. The flavor was described as similar to black tea. The flavor was described as identical to light roasted oolong. The flavor was described as identical to green tea. The flavor was described as identical to oolong tea. The flavor was described as identical to milk tea. So, it's a little repetitive. It comes off as a little poorly constructed, sort of plastic manufacturing here, just low quality manufacturing, I think. And then we get to this interview, and this is the next collapsible here. It's the interview with the -A instance, and so we get a little bit more, first person, mano a mano kind of description of what's happening here. And I think that this article's interview here is really where it drives it home that this is really like somehow a shop that has been displaced from its native universe into our reality, so to speak. And that native universe is a video game. It is an RPG. Just it's one set in another universe that sort of bridges our two worlds. And that's really, really it. So this interview sort of goes on to establish that. You have the A instance a little baffled that the Foundation representative doesn't know who the flavorless king is, who is apparently this Ganon equivalent of this video game universe wherein this shop is located. So it's a little clever. I really like that, kind of taking that perspective of playing a video game and like making this place, come alive, so to speak, and going at it in a discovery fashion from a totally different angle. That's just kind of ultimately surprising. So I think the pacing and the concept of this article are nice. The pacing is such that it slowly sort of unveils for you, almost like if you ever see people derobe a new car at a car show. Just, you kind of can see what's under there, and then they slowly pull that back, and it's sexy. That's just what it is. So this article kind of does the same thing. It really sort of slowly, kind of lets you know and insinuates what it is that this is. But by the time you get to the end, I think it just sort of collapses a little bit. It kind of deflates by being shown what it is. I think it's unfortunately just a pretty low-hanging idea that somebody just kind of plucked and put here. I mean, the treatment of this doesn't really go very far. It's just kind of the laziest, I think, that you could take this article to, the laziest point, which is just maybe a couple of steps. You just basically bring the health potion shop into an SCP world, and that's kind of it. You just have these sort of auto-translate components like the evil flavorless king and the hero. So, I think it's a little unimpressive. I think on the whole, it's it got a little contrived of a feel, just because we kind of figure out what it is, and it doesn't really get much better after that. But it's cute. I think it's cute, and at the time of recording, this was +10, so I mean it's probably a little more than that now before Wiki went down. But I think that's fair for this article, and good enough for a read. It's relatively short. Like I said, I think there's some moments in here that are nice. So, I recommend you read that. That's fine. All right, so that's SCP-ZH-048. And the next one, once again, these first ones we actually have captured here, is SCP-6478. And so this one, even out of the gate, was doing very well for itself at +24. So you look at the picture, and obviously this is a little pill. It's a pharmaceutically based, basically, anomaly here. And I'll go ahead and allay your anxieties or concerns in that this is not a Dado article. So, hooray. This is an anomalous derealization and depersonalization pill that involves taking this pharmaceutical, is basically what happens. So to read the description, which is all caps, I don't mind that. Looks good. The SCP is a phenomenon that primarily affects individuals suffering from recurrent and consistent derealization and depersonalization. And it goes on to define those things, basically zoning out, tuning out, things like this. So the Conprocs are interesting to me in that the containment seems to be getting people with the version of this anomalous pill in the wild to take it. So, for example, unused instances are to be confiscated, yada, yada, yada. If a subject is found in possession of the -1, the -1 being the actual pill, as the image caption tells you, the personnel are to attempt to coerce the individual in the wild into taking the pill. So that's a little interesting. It doesn't really seem like that's something that the Foundation would do. So that's a little bit of a curveball. That's not something you see every day. So I thought that was a little interesting. This at the last line kind of tells us that this is basically an unreality article, and so it kind of finally shows itself right there. Let me move this over just a bit. So it does the style of unreality very well, I think, which is really sort of dancing around a vague concept or an absence of a concept. It has a sharp minimalism and a puzzle-style nagging that really insinuates there's an ocean more of depth underneath what is presented. And it gives you, if the old adage is to show and not tell, this is not even showing it. It's kind of gesturing to something in hushed signals. That's kind of what unreality does. So I think this does a very, very good job. And there are some very nice subtleties in here that may not be apparent upon the first read. For example, the containment class is Thaumiel. So that's a little bit of a puzzle piece in there too, to kind of help kind of figure out what it is that is going on in here. And it also gives this sort of an extra echo of unresolved notes even by the end. So it does encourage you to think about it a little more. The addendum is really where the action takes place. It does a very, very concise and good job of this, just with a few examples here. I assume that the Foundation has more, sample sizes than this. I hope their N doesn't equal 4 for this one, but even so, it does come across very well. So I appreciate the author being brief and to the point with this, with not a lot of extra fat on the article, really just getting to it. So, maybe it was because this was an article about a pharmaceutical that didn't feature Dado, but I was really pleasantly surprised by this one. It was short and sweet. It's worth a read. I think there's a comment. We won't try to go to the comments since it's just such a low probability play with all the WikiDot being down. But there was one comment here that basically captured this article very well, so I'm going to reuse that. I apologize to whoever that is. I didn't get your name, thinking that I would be able to get it right now. But the comment was basically, the Unreality Department borrows a guy's consciousness and other people's consciousnesses to work for their department. So it's sort of like their talent scouting in a way, or some sort of like recruiting that kind of is there somehow. So once again, I wish I could tell you who the author is. Quicksilver's. So that's really good. I remember Quicksilver's had a few articles in the last month that we looked at. So yeah, great job. Really, if you're a fan of Unreality, it really captures that mood, which is almost just like a suggestion. It's almost like this very brief and faint scent that you get on a breeze. That's what the Department of Unreality is. And so I think this one does a really, really good job. So I do recommend you read this. Once again, it is short, so even if you don't like it, even if it doesn't really hit you in the right spot and have that mix of vagueness, ambiguity, and suggestion, even if you think that it doesn't quite hit that right, it's short, so you won't have committed a whole lot to it. All right, that's that. So the next one is SCP 6884, and this is a nice looking article with the black background. I tend to like the black background ones a lot. You get different kind of highlight, accents here and there. And then of course the ACS, I think, only looks good on black. I think putting it on black is the only way ACS is going to look good, period. I think it looks terrible without that black background help. So what is this? 6884. This one was doing pretty well for itself at 18 when this was captured. But this is essentially anomalously large dogs, wolves, foxes, and sort of black cats that roam at night and that can burrow like moles to create subterranean tunnels. And there's nice imagery work here. So this one right here, as you see, is a nice sort of landscape portrait image that gives you a real nice impression of some rolling hills. And I don't know how well you can see it on the stream, especially, let me see. You can kind of see it. So there's this instance in the middle here that it draws your attention to. And it's really interesting because it looks like a giant panther. And it's just a very strange thing to see. It doesn't seem as though this photo is doctored at all. So I am curious to see that at the end. But it looks very, very natural, and it's just a little odd. What is a panther doing in this setting? You typically wouldn't see it in such a setting. So either really, really good job on the author for mining a good image from which to, draw an SCP around, or if this is doctored, let's actually just go ahead and find out. Oh, we can't. I love this green. It's so bold, such a bold green. I don't see the licensing thing at the bottom of this, so that's okay. We won't know. Anyway, either way, good job. An engaging picture in this. So we also see a cryptozoology header up here, so that tells us also something about what is going on before we read much. Yeah, and once again, the ACS looks pretty good, so decent job. The conprocs are okay, nothing too special here. Kind of tells us a little bit about the things digging and living in caves and things like that. And we also have some more believability in these nicely constructed images here as well. I think once we get to the description, let me just read this. The SCP is an unidentified subterranean species of mammal bearing resemblance to members of the panther genus while possessing some characteristics of Caniformia, suborder, which is like dogs and foxes and wolves and things like this. And so it goes on to describe its description. It's really a large size. There are a couple of decisions in here in designing the anomaly that are a little odd, that come off as a little questionable. Like, for example, they have these eyes that light up yellow. They're very bright yellow. And so that's just, not necessarily a bad choice, but it does kind of bring to mind sort of the same sort of design that you would see in like a cartoon that has like some beast and has these glowing eyes. It just seems a little bit of, too simple of a decision there. And we'll come back to that because it turns out that intuition that I had while reading this was a good one. Because we find out just how contrived the addition of yellow eyes become to this article and its structure and its setup. So all things considered, I think it's a relatively mundane anomaly with nothing particularly interesting going on. You do have to applaud the author here because, 9 out of 10 times when you see an anomaly that's like a big animal cat with glowing eyes and sharp claws and it's scary. Like, that's 9 out of 10 times that article is going to just plummet immediately. It's going to sink. So kudos to the author for taking, what could be described as a difficult starting point, an anomaly that isn't really quite like interesting or conceptually challenging or even all that imaginative on the face of it. But ultimately making a pretty good article out of that. So, and certainly a successful one that's made it to the wiki. So let's take a look at footnote 3. So even given footnote 3, which lets us know that the statement justifying this as a Euclid type anomaly is being revisited in a light of an incident. So we're now pending reclassification of the alpha incident into something other than Euclid. So, I think that's kind of like the strike through. I mean, we say that all the time. The typical way you see that is when it actually lists the containment class and it has it struck out. Usually you see this in a manner of it being safe, and then that is struck out, and then you get like some sort of higher stakes containment class, and that's a way of sort of, peppering the tension of the article and sort of foreshadowing that this is maybe something that's going to happen that'll up the stakes a little bit. There's some kind of incident. That's really what this footnote 3 does. But even here, once again, just with the ingredients that the author is presenting to us already, it doesn't really, you don't really taste it, so to speak. It doesn't really push you, I think, as much as maybe the author was hoping that it might. So, we go into the history and the folklore significance of this. We talk about an investigation of it. I think that ultimately it's just a pretty garden variety of a setup so far. But once again, the article does a fairly good job of what it's trying to do, especially given the ingredients. So it plays off of folk sightings. That's really what this is about. Sort of sets it in sort of a cultural history. And creates this sense of a long intertwined history and really adds to the idea of these things being quite elusive. In fact, I think it even says, though, due to the species' outwardly non-anomalous nature and tendency to flee once sighted, this has not been deemed a threat to secrecy or the veil at large. And so that's interesting. Once again, that's another sort of compositional curveball we don't see a whole lot, but it doesn't do any favors for the tension. It doesn't really do anything for that, that attempt of the author to engage sort of the sympathetic nervous system of the reader and get the reader sort of involved. The stakes are very, very low with this. I mean, so it's like we're trying to capture the anomaly, but I mean, if we don't, is it really going to matter? So, I get the decision. It's just, it's going to have some consequences here and there. I think it definitely does sort of have a trade-off for the, sort of the energy level of the article, I think, suffers because of decisions like that. The clinical tone also sputters at times. There was one passage that I was quite surprised to see. I would say the clinical tone is usually pretty good in this on the whole. There's really nothing that sticks out too bad, except for, and maybe they fixed it, there was a phrase in there that said, an anomalous big cat species. Oh, yeah, there it is. So this is the investigation addendum. Although the Foundation suspected the presence of an anomalous big cat species in Britain since the 1970s, yada, yada, yada. I just think that could be cleaned up just a little bit. That was a little distracting for me. I think the interviews here, we get several interviews, POI interviews. It looks like 2 of them here. I think that they are well paced, but ultimately I think they're listless and also uninteresting. They don't really move the article forward, but for maybe a little bump. We do find out that the anomalies can talk to one another, even though this talking is below the threshold of human hearing. And I think there is even a footnote about that at some point. So we get a little more ingredients, a little more additions to the anomaly from what we started with, and I don't necessarily think this is a good one. Anytime you take a anomaly and you try to make it talk or have capabilities of speech, that's generally a fault line for a lot of articles, particularly ones that cast, sort of sapient or pseudo-sapient animals. Once you decide that they can talk, it does take a lot of, I think, the mystery and intrigue out of it. But more than that, you're really treading on very tenuous compositional ground, because it's very, very easy to make a talking animal anomaly just absolute garbage. So this one actually avoids that. So kudos to the author doing that. They introduced the idea that the anomaly can speak, but it doesn't actually, like, for example, go into an example of these things speaking to each other that is transcribed by the Foundation, and it doesn't, thank God, have an interview with the anomaly, the talking animal anomaly. So good restraint on that. Once again, this author is taking some, rather perilous ingredients, and I think doing a better job with them than most people will do. So there's definitely something to be said about that. And I like the inventiveness here of footnote 6. So we see a designation that says SA6884, and footnote tells us that this is a suspected anomaly being a placeholder prior to confirmation of an anomalous nature. So I don't know if that's a common thing on the wiki. I certainly haven't seen it a lot myself. I just love little, details like this, just sort of almost microscopic attentiveness to really just an elegance to the details. I really, really like that. So just wanted to point that out. So the video transcript, let's see, I think that's this must be here, right here. Yeah, the video transcript we see, it's got dates and times. The times are interestingly given their own space in the article with center alignment and some page breaks basically here around them. So that's an interesting, once again, visual decision. I haven't seen that a lot, so hey, the author's trying some new things, so appreciate that. I think the actual text of this transcript here is a little slow. Once again, the pacing is a little slow. The direction of the interview is a little meandering, and it also gets to really the exact points that we might expect them to, thanks to all of the information really about the anomaly already told to us in the description. So, that's a tough decision to make if you're writing an SCP, because if you are trying to be in character, if you're trying to write from the perspective in universe, obviously the description is where you want to give a lot of the information. But if you do that, if you give all the information really about the anomaly in the description, that's just one extra step of difficulty that you are giving yourself, because you have to find some way to use that as a springboard into other elements of the article. The other option is to not describe as much in the description and leave it very, very vague. That's also a difficult direction to circumnavigate things in, because if you do that too much, there's a very fine example of this in DJ Cactus's excellent article otherwise, but it's the Oh Death one, where it's really sort of the trope of being as unhelpful as possible. It's like the one thing that you need to know about this anomaly, they don't write it in the description anywhere, and it seems to be sort of like in universe a contrivance for a good story, which is great. I understand we're entertaining others by writing here, but that's the risk that you fall into when you try to make the description too vague. You get to the point of asking sort of these in-character questions that can confound the whole decision, the whole compositional direction. Like, why the hell didn't you put that in the containment procedures? That's maybe something that I would want to know, and my team, by the way. So in this case, the author basically gives us all the details. Like I said, we learn a little later that the anomaly talks, so that's something new. But it really comes back to bite the read in the rear when it comes to this transcript, because we already know all this information. So it's a little repetitive of a read, and it feels a little unrewarding to get through. There's somewhat of a twist at the end, if you can call it that, but it's really more of a revelation. This is interesting, but reveals, I think, more questionable workmanship in the anomaly's design. For example, this is an ancient species. This big cat species is an ancient one that has evolved to speak below human hearing and has become all black in its coloration for concealment purposes. But yet, at the same time, these things are stated in the article to kind of give the indication that these things have been evolving to avoid detection for quite some time. But at the same time, we have that juxtaposed by the fact that these SCPs are notably identifiable due to their distinctly glowing amber color eyes. So this just kind of juts out as a very odd inclusion for the whole article, until you realize at the end with the Foundation researchers that this was really an overt design to make these sort of giant cats somewhat resemble cars, because they sort of like see cars and they think they're like members of their own species. That's kind of something that we see happen here. So once again, the design, as if you're drawing, if you're a visual artist drawing an anomaly, the design is a little contrived. It sort of had that in mind the entire time, and it finally kind of shows up at the end, and we finally get the answer to the question that we may have had at the beginning, which is, why do these things have giant yellow glowing eyes? Well, it's so that they can be confused when they see a car and think that a car is part of their species. And then there's also other sort of strange juxtapositions compositionally and conceptually and tonally. For example, the author makes these giant cat beasts sapient at the last minute. As we saw, they're capable of not only speaking in English, but if you look at the very last line, they actually write in English as well. So this line says, upon inspection of the containment cell, the following text was etched into the farthest wall, not follow. So not only are these cats sort of like sapient, they can speak English, they can avoid detection by speaking English, but they can also write with their claws in English. And so that's fine if you want to do that. That's fine. I certainly think that that's kind of a negative for the article if you try to do that in that direction. But it has a bigger problem, which is that you contrast this clear, very strong intelligence of this anomaly, and it stands in a sudden and stark contrast to their inability to differentiate a running black vehicle from one of their own species. So it's sort of like is this cherry picking of intelligence that doesn't really shine through consistently, and we could toss that up to individuals of the species sort of having differences between themselves. But I think just from the perspective knowing that the author read this, it comes off as just kind of grossly uneven of design. Where when it's convenient for these things to be confused and not very bright, thinking that a car is one of their species, that's there. And then in other times where it's convenient to have them be able to write English so that we can understand what happened at the very end of the article, that's there too. So, there are little moments in this, like I said, as we talked, that impressed me about this article. But overall, I think this is a pretty generic, largely uninteresting article that never really ticks above, let's say, a 3 or 4 out of 10 on the intrigue scale. It's not terribly long, but I don't think it's interesting enough to justify even the length that is here. It does sort of feel like an SCP, like a 1,000 contest entry. So, that it has that going for it. And if you like that sort of vibe, this might be an article for you to go check out. Do I recommend it? This is one of those ones that I just, whatever, it's not terribly long. A lot of people have liked it. There is a lot of good things to like about this. And once again, I think the biggest compliment I can give this article is that the author really did really, really good for what the ingredients were. They're not good ingredients, in my opinion. There's a very limited variety of things that you could make that are, edible, I think, in these ingredients and the combinations that they present. But the author did a very, very good job, I think, in that regard. So if you want to read it, check it out. You can go to the web archive and type in the SCP URL. So what I've been doing is, let's say, what is this, 6884? So I'll just do 6884, and then of course, Amino Apps pops up first. This is just a terrible sign of our times. But you click on the actual SCP Wiki URL. Of course, we get the error message, and then we can just go back to the Wayback Machine. If you don't know what that is, then shame on you. And hit the Wayback Machine right there, type it in, and it should pull up the most recent version for you. This one was on the 15th of May, so that's how I got to that one, and boom, there we are. So I'm not going to let that thing load. My computer's slow right now. Okay, next one. We're going to go a little bit out of order because, like I said, a few of these were captured before the wiki went down. So the next one that was captured is SCP-6850. SCP-6850. Okay. This is really fresh after coming on the wiki. This did pretty well for itself. I think when I read it, it was, plus 10, something like that. I don't know. What can I say about this? So just in summary, this is a sapient sphere, and you can see that right here. This is sort of a black sphere that is always on fire, and that has 3 other states. You have an inert state, an alert state, which rhymes, and then an agitated state. One of these is more manic than the other. The agitated is more manic than the other. And this anomaly has convinced people that it is human. It sort of has this cognitohazardous effect where people who talk to it sort of think it's a human for some reason. And then it also has this second component, a -A. Let's see if we can pull that up. -A is, let's find the description of it. Yeah, the -A is a smooth hemispherical tungsten bowl with a diameter just over that of the SCP. Prior to containment, the SCP usually elected to adorn the item on its upper half when mobile and at rest with its lower half while inert. So it's something like a hat that it wears or sits on, whatever. It's like half hat, half chamber pot, which is not a good combination to have. So once again, we do, through the description and the imagery here, have sort of a fire theme going on with, like I said, some perception-altering elements to this. There's a cliche in the containment procedures that I'm really starting to see quite a lot of, and that is the good behavior containment perks cliche. And then once you add that to other cliches that are here, like the inert state cliche, there's also these cliche anthropomorphization of the typically inert object that we'll see a little bit more of as well. So, as far as the description of this anomaly is concerned, I think the imagery is really actually fantastic. If you look at this, it's hard for me to actually see what this was when I first tried to figure it out, but you've got kind of a close-up shot. There's a little bit of a rim bowl right there. You can sort of see the cusp of it right there with the light shining off of it. And you've got this really nice effect. This is clearly something that's flammable that was lit on fire, and then a picture was taken of it. So good job with that. I think there's a little bit of a concrete wall back here, which kind of gives that nice realistic setting of a containment cell, which I'm sure is pretty root in its design. So That's basic setup of this article. I think there are some problems with it. So we have this phase table here. I already talked about how really the elements that the author's getting started with here really does sort of cast some cliches. Now that's not terrible in its own state. For example, if you were around for the 2019 cliche contest, you know well that cliches can be done very, very well. So it's not necessarily those ingredients, but the author is starting out with some cliches that are just little singeing of the nostrils a little bit. But let's get to some issues. So the first sentence after the tables, so this is the table right here. This sentence right here is just a tremendous run-on. I'm going to try to read this. Additionally, SCP possesses the ability to influence nearby individuals in such a way that, upon anything more than momentary exposure, induce them to perceive SCP as a normal human person in appearance as well as speech, as SCP is able to verbally communicate in slightly to moderately broken English through unknown means. Its voice has been consistently described as or along the lines of high-pitched and hissing by personnel not under the effect of its perception-altering influence. That was one sentence. I mean, it's got some pausing punctuation in there, but that's a terrible run-on sentence. You gotta construct your sentence a little better than that. So there are moments in this read where you sort of get tipped off to the author not really having the best grip on what it is they're doing. And I think ultimately when you analyze the anomaly a little more, you just have this sort of vibe of it being a little too many components at play here. You should always try to simplify your anomaly as much as possible. The only things that you have there should be absolutely necessary. And the reason for that is because obviously the more you try to throw in there, it's like a stew. The more you try to throw in there to try to make it, good, the less these things are going to have a chance to harmonize with one another. And then of course, when you introduce more elements into an anomaly, that's really, unless you're treating that very conservatively and skillfully, that really just brings more opportunities for you to do something wrong in, or you to trip up over or fail at. So you really want to kind of keep these things as simple as you can. And you have a bunch of different sort of components going on here. It's on fire, it can talk, it makes things think that it's a human, it's got this bowl thing that it wears on its head and on its bottom, and it's just sort of a scatterbrained image. It's much, much better if you can keep that very laser-like and focused so that the reader obviously has a very vivid mental image of what it is that you're going for and can carry that with them well past the article itself. So we get down to the addenda. The first one is a discovery. I think the discovery here is thoughtful with some nice and unique imagery. We get down to an interview with the character, and this is, I think, where the article starts to take a nosedive. I think it does some serious mistakes here. The character treatment is Neo-Lol Foundation, with the SCP calling itself Blaze Orbison. It does this in an apparent serious attempt to get people to believe that it's a Foundation employee, which is, not good. Not good. It gets lines that are in all caps. You can see those here on the screen. We have some rather adolescent lines as well. So if we go to here, you'll see some of these, like these are really in all caps as well. Anyway, I can't find it, but the anomaly at some point says the word boo, like it's booing something. There it is. Boo. Lame. Much lame. No trust. And that's another comment to say there. It sort of has this broken English baked into the character that calls to mind something like Dado, but without all the charming qualities to it. And so it's just, once again, very difficult. It's really easy to write crappy broken English, and it's very difficult to read through it. And so, if you don't have something like a Dado character that's just way too charming to not read through it, it doesn't play very well. And so that's what I think this article suffers from right here. And then additionally, as you might be able to anticipate with this sort of Neo-Lol Foundation turning of the characterization with this ball that's on fire, the Foundation personnel are also kind of ditzy beyond belief, ditzy beyond tolerance. So for example, let's take this characteristic exchange from the second interview right here. The SCP says, okay, you look like not lying now, unlike last time. We'll try, ... No laughy company, though. And then the Foundation agent says, sorry, did you say laughy, or do you mean funny business? SCP flames begin to quickly grow and flicker in color. Will funny to get up in your business. So this is the sort of treatment that we would call Neo-Lol Foundation, where the anomaly is desperately trying to be funny. The Foundation personnel, for some reason, tend to play along with it and make themselves much dumber than they probably professionally should be. So I think that once we get to here, the article is firmly in the do not recommend and or downvote territory for me personally. This is not a pleasant read. It's pretty excruciating to get through. So I don't recommend this at all. There are other sort of indications of a lack of polish. In this article, for example, we have errant syntax hanging out here with this double bracket that's closing double bracket here, just kind of hanging out. So this plays like a poor sort of culturally insensitive caricature of the anomaly, and it doesn't really get any better. The interview logs are rather painful to get through. Like I said, it really leans on the strategy of the writing, as most of the remaining editions are interviews, which I think each one sort of cheapens the article a little bit more than the last one. So in this way, because it relies so heavily on these interviews that don't do a good job of characterization, and that sort of devolve the read and the anomaly here to something that would be fit on a cartoon show. In this way, the article and author sort of puts its worst foot forward and leans all of its weight into that foot. The interviews here, and there's further interviews as you can see, they feel like the author is trying to convey a cute character in the SCP, but it's really a one-trick character who lives within the gaff-filled spaces between cultural understandings and amounts to the emotional depth of a toddler, going on temper tantrums, for example, when they don't get what they want. And that's just not very interesting. It's just not a very interesting thing to read. So this sort of technique of characterization and dialogue is sort of played ad infinitum with no real meaningful variation or movement or direction with it. It's just sort of there. It's sort of taken to be its own excuse to be there. A later addendum goes into ways the anomaly has attempted containment breaches. So let's find that. Here it is, escape attempts. So we have escape attempts here, which is another cliche. I mean, I feel like this would have been an entry in the Cliche Con because it deals with so many things that are classically cliche. But it goes into the ways, this addendum here goes into the ways that the anomaly has attempted containment breaches, and then it details a successful one. I think it is down here. Yeah, so this is initially successful, but recontained, and so it gives its own addendum, own collapsible for this successful attempt. And this successful attempt does this stale, boring flavor and does the article no favors as well, in my opinion. So the successful containment breach is anticlimactic and ultimately goes nowhere, with nothing really being added to the article. Just to point out a few more polish errors, there's a lot of it and its confusion. So almost every time, honestly, you should see ITS, it's instead IT''S. I think it's pretty poor composition and clinical tone throughout this article. Let's find an example here, if we can. Here's an example of poor clinical tone. The closing statement here: shortly following the events described above, a rapidly spreading forest fire rapidly spread near the south perimeter of the site. So this is just obviously highly redundant. The author has not noticed that they repeat two words immediately and in the same sequence: rapidly spread, rapidly spread. So that's just that's bad. So ultimately, I think this is a meandering, I think it's a very bland anomaly with annoying characterization that seems to feel it is good enough to carry the article when it is not. It is haphazard in its construction. It adds on numerous appendages to the anomaly that never really come into play. such as it being able to come off as human to those with lesser cognitive inoculations. And then new features are created during these interviews, during these addenda, in order to develop the plot, almost added like a plug to a leak at the last minute when these things sort of present themselves, such as in the successful containment breach log. Other components cast at the beginning of the article, for example, this -A that we looked at, never really make a return or make any meaningful appearance other than being casually discussed one more time in this successful containment breach attempt. A good example of this is the picture of SCP-6580 in its agitated state. So if we go back up here, this picture really says a lot, I think, for me in my assessment of this article. This anomaly is supposed to be a sphere. It is supposed to be on fire when it's mad. And we clearly see a log in a fireplace here. That's what this picture is right here, over here. And then, of course, the flames are given this odd tricolor tone sort of overlay, which, just seems like a lot of fluff. It doesn't really do much visually, which is the only reason it's there. It's never talked about for any other reason than it just being what the author thought was a cool picture. But unfortunately, it's a log, very clearly, in this fireplace. That's very clearly a fireplace. So I think, unfortunately, this is just a terribly cliche article. It was almost sadistic in that it punishes the reader to get through, and apparently seems to love it. So I do not recommend this article at all. I think it is still successful by the time that WikiDot went down this week, so read it for yourself if you want to see for yourself, or if you might like it, if what I said is something that you like. But I think it's just a little too long to even recommend, even if you don't like it. So if this didn't sound like an interesting read to you, I would recommend that you just don't do it. All right, moving on. This is, I think, the last one from this week that we have visualization of. So we may, honestly, what we may do is just save the ones. That's probably what we'll do. We'll probably just save the ones that don't have visuals to them for next week. I'll just throw them on because they're already done. So it may be a little longer next week if we get things up. But then again, the wiki's supposed to come back up on, Monday? So that's a couple days we don't have to synopsize articles from. So we'll see. But so let's talk about this one. This is SCP-6864. And I think most of this is correctly loaded by the Wayback Machine, so that's nice to see. I don't think we have... Yeah, we do. We have a collapsible, but it looks like it opens up, so that's good news. We'll close that just to be fidelitous to the read. So as you can see just from the intro, this is severe format screw, lots of code facade, and some IT techno vibes. There's a content warning up here. I don't know if this will show. Yes, it does. That tells us that suggestive content regarding physical or bodily harm and mental physical harassment, scary images too. So that's quite tantalizing. And then the header here makes this seem, it's hard to see because it's behind the Wayback Machine, but it says Bellwood Staffing as the SCP logo up here. So sort of lets us know we got a little bit of an HR vibe going on. So the first thing we see is a block of IT code, sort of babble, but it's a very succinct and dramatic escalation of IT babble events, telling us that there was an error trying to connect with a digital interface of an SCP operating system and a subconsciousness. So there's already this sort of, let me turn this music down. There's already this sort of disconnect that is sort of telling you that things are going to go wrong here in this article with these error messages. You really don't even have to read this. Just seeing the errors is probably enough to do that. But it's well done. It's nice and concise. Just a very interesting on-ramp, I think, to the article, and does a good job building a little bit of initial dissonance and tension right off the bat. So this error, kernel crash detected, halting system startup, sort of means that there's corrupted data all over the place in this article. The operating system then boots into a safe mode. So that's relatable. We all know what that is like. So, there's, as you can already tell, just this artificial cleanliness to this article. And if it seems like almost too clean, too artificially clean, something like maybe a talk show host would have, just creaseless faces and just perfectly make-upped and these perfect smiles, dazzling white smiles. That's kind of what this article comes off as. It's like a kind of smile that you don't want to receive. That's sort of what this article starts off like feeling to me, which is a good feeling. It's very well captured. So the article is framed by, first of all, this sort of IT intro, and also by this, which is an acceptance letter from Bellwood Staffing, which is sort of the central character in this. Well, not character, I guess antagonist, if you will. But basically, so it's an acceptance letter here from Bellwood Staffing, which has a very believable stationery. I really love this logo work right here. It's just simple, and it is exactly what you would be seeing, from something like a staffing department of this nature. The divs, as we scroll down into the actual article, which is essentially synchronizing memories from whatever subconsciousness it has attached itself to, even if not completely. We see that the divs are sort of arranged like stacks of paper, with these little stacks back here jutting out. That's a nice little touch, I think. Usually I'm not a big fan of clear gimmicks like that, but I think this actually works really well for some reason. It has something to do with the cleanliness of the article. I just think it was well decided upon. The SCP format here takes on a very interesting form as a job description posting, such as location, work type. The containment procedures are recast as special work requirements. And so while this reads very, very believable, very, very fidelitous to hiring postings, this is exactly what you would read, for somebody who's posted a job description or a job application. It is also a little dry and uninteresting by the same token, except for one line about employees being willing to consume or regularly regularly use enhancing supplements for the sake of improved work performance. So that's this little sour note in what otherwise is a pristine harmony, a pristine scale, the pristine chord of the delivery in this article. So that's sort of should be kind of, squinting your eyes for you. So this is just, once again, very, very nice sort of tonal decoration going on here. The author knows what they're doing. So that's nice to see. There are some other ominous dissonances in the tone, such as the ending of the December 2021 div. If not, don't worry, we saved the memory so we could enjoy it forever. We also get some very, very creepy vibes in the next log from this Alan character, who is just someone who is in this Bellwood Staffing and comes off as just incredibly creepy. There's a reproduced company hire welcome video that has some glitchy sort of deliveries. Let's see if we can find that. Is this? Yeah. So this is it. Basically what we've done here is loaded up a transcription of a sort of hiring video, something that you would show somebody who was just hired to this company. And this is what has those glitchy delivery things with an unsettling camera angle in there. Just an odd choice that once again adds just one extra note in this sort of climbing dissonance of like, what the hell is going on here? There's a feeling in this transcript of this hiring video that makes you feel like there's just a lot that is being suppressed. Not the things that they don't want to get out are being suppressed in this video. So this is really, I think, where the fulcrum is, where this dissonance that's kind of slowly been bubbling in the backdrop really starts to take center stage and is almost spotlit, I would say, in this portion of the article. So it's really an inflection point, I think, tonally for the piece. I think it's gotten there really effectively. We sort of see it coming. It's not so laboriously hinted at that it's trite and uninteresting by the time we get to it, but it is sort of backed up enough to where we are satisfied to get to it once it finally is there. So, yeah. The guiding, I think, through this section is pretty unsettling, although at times it does have this sort of Hollywood scary movie vibes. At times, just for example, what the author decides to do with the blocking of one of the people that is shown in here, just standing in the middle of the hall, like basically almost covered in blood and stuff like this. I don't think that's literally what's happening, but it's kind of the vibe that you get. So there's sort of these Hollywood scary movie vibes at times, and I think it really doesn't do a lot of favors to what this article's strength has been so far, which is sort of a subtle vibe. And so we get a couple of things like this in here that are sort of these garish decisions that suddenly sort of, almost too eagerly, too enthusiastically sort of break their own restraint. Like, for example, this all caps line, another black screen now displaying, you are always at fault. Remember that you are always at fault, and white letters fill the screen. So it's just sort of like, it starts to become a little less believable when you do this, which is a shame because, once again, that's where I think the article has been very strong. It's really getting its creepy factor from being very realistic. Like, once again, just the fidelitousness to an actual job posting and these sort of odd inclusions showing up here. I think at this point, if you were cooking it, you would have burnt it. It's just a little overbaked when these things happen. The next segment here sort of introduces sort of an escalation in the creepiness in this sort of like very paranormal, parasocial relationship that this staffing company has with its own employees. It almost borders at this point on kind of like a Stockholm Syndrome tone. This sounds all throughout this next addendum. And we are met next with an iPhone text message screen cap. This is a lot like what we saw recently with that J. Dunes article with the Ghost Girl SCP. Really the same formatting here, but this certainly comes off as creepy. I think the a little sort of missteps and trips that the tone, that the subtlety makes up here, let's say in this video segment transcription, I think it picks up again very, very nicely here. There's really, really creepy moments in these text messages. And it's got like this sort of bad dream vibe where it's like it just keeps coming back. You think you escape, you think you've changed the dream, and it just won't let you get away. And so that's kind of what this is. It's not to say that you could see it coming, but once you read this, you're like, oh, of course that happened. So I think it does that pretty well. And then the next part, I think, is really what the content warning was about. We get a scene that's really, really disturbing with a bit of torture and a bit of gore. Now, this is well described, so, I hate it if you weren't able to appreciate the actual writing here because of the content warnings and things like this, but this is just very well done body horror, very descriptive. So it's kind of got this Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibe going on here in this part. There's this ghastly group euphoria element that's played here well. That really adds to the feeling of sheer hostility, panic, helplessness that that our protagonist is in, and that, of course, by this point we're starting to feel as well. And the next portion I thought was pretty cool. There's an attachment here. We get basically this like one of us sort of victory statement here, and the attachment is an ID badge that has this rather disturbing Photoshop effect of somebody without any facial features. So this, by the way, is Agent Jackrabbit from Twitter, who I suppose is kind of was asked to be the model for this ID badge. So the name checks out too, Jacqueline O'Hare. And this is, by the way, let's just appreciate what we can here. So, I mean, this is very well done, the photoshopping of this. There's no obvious fault in the actual picture here. It's not very, very clearly doctored, so that's nice. That's really sustaining the suspending the disbelief there, with that being a very, very skillful photoshopping of this image. So it doesn't have any obvious signs of fault. It's not very believable at the same time. Like I think you either went or you laughed when you saw this. I don't think anybody was like, really struck by this. That's not really the way I took this. So does it work as a picture here in this point in the article? That's up to you to decide. I appreciate it just because I think it's rather well done. These things that come off very seamlessly like this, they're much harder to do in real life. So, could it be a little more effective? Yeah. Is there an argument here that not showing something like this leaves a more poignant impression on the reader because it's in their imagination only? Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made there. It doesn't really bother me that it's there, so I'll let you be the judge of that on your own. I think it's sort of a lukewarm addition, but at least the article doesn't end on that. If the article did end on that, it would have been quite anticlimactic, in my opinion. So, but the narrative does move on a little more. It's really that these newly recruited employees sort of sniff out how disturbing and wrong this company is, and then they try to leave. And then, of course, that company intercepts this employee's attempt to leave, and they basically mutilate her before allowing her to do so. This last little bit, which is not quite note at the end syndrome, it's a nice little dialogue, and it actually is sort of like the typical Metal Gear Solid ending where, like, after the credits, that little comm ding, 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 ding comes up, and you get, sort of mysterious talking between people. But I think this does that really well. So we actually do get information from this. It actually does push along the narrative a bit, and it's not just like an exposition dump, which is really what makes Note at the End syndrome so bad, is when it's just characterless. It's not really embedded well into the narrative. It's just exposition dumping. So I think this is a really nice way to end it. Once again, I think that if it had ended up here, that would have been pretty bad. But from this little dialogue, this little exchange, we get that this incident with this employee who tried to leave, who kind of sniffed out that things were going not the way they should be going. We get from this little interaction that was not supposed to happen. The company has this sort of digital consciousness interface software that started out the article, that's apparently still in its beta stages, but it still has some kinks to work out. So the character's recognition of the company as a sadistic and evil thing was really one of those bugs in their software. And the final conversation here at the end tells us that it's the company's primary project to fix that, and hopefully it should be perfected pretty soon. So that's the end of the article. What do I think of this article? Let me get a sip. I think it's good. I think it's a good article. I think it's very, very cleanly presented. I think it has a very vivid understanding of what it wants to accomplish and how it does take some very well-known ingredients, like kind of the creepy family, the creepy adopted family vibe, the sort of one of us Google Gobble sort of thing going on. It also has this intensity of a faux capitalistic HR, marketing posture, creepiness. And of course, we have the nice contrast, the nice sort of staging with this lone protagonist who's really the only one in this situation who is in this position. So just very extreme themes of isolation and loneliness. I particularly think that the author did an excellent job of sort of slamming the reader into that isolation when the author tries to invoke, something as reliable, perhaps, something as savior-esque as a cry out to help for a mother figure, for your mom. And then your mom it's like a bad dream. It's like your mom is the evil guy as well. So yeah, I think that this does really, really well for itself. Once again, I think at times it does hug a little too close to the recipe that Hollywood thrillers tend to go through. So this is something that we might see in a Hollywood thriller. I particularly think that this passage where they do a lot of the gore, I think that is sort of Hollywood-esque. And as I said before, in this, what's basically a hiring video transcript, this gets probably the most Hollywood-esque out of the whole piece. So it does hug that a little too close. It's essentially Jordan Peele's Get Out, but with a wannabe GOI PR company. So in that regard, it does what it wants to do well, the article, but I think that it does sort of trip over itself at times in that. The strength of this article is its polish. I didn't see one typo, which is not common at all. And the clinical tone here really, really shines, particularly in the descriptive passages. So once again, if we head down here to this sort of difficult scene with the gore and the torture, the sort of body horror that goes on here, and the sort of action that happens is so well and vividly described. It's just very, very disturbing. So that's a kudos to the author as well. The strongest weakness, though, is a fundamental mistake and miss, in my opinion. This is an anomalous event. It is an anomalous group of interest kind of thing going on here. But we're never truly given an anomaly in this article. There's nothing really. Once again, the actual SCP format is modified to sort of be in this job posting sort of packaging. So as much as I like this article, as much as I have a lot of good things to say about this article, I have to ask, because I'm always thinking about these fundamental things. I'm a very principled thinker when it comes to containment fiction, when it comes to writing in this genre. And so at the end of it, I have to sort of like scratch my head and say, well, what was the anomaly here? It really doesn't have one. It's completely eager to present itself kind of uniquely, and I think kind of overdoes it a bit. It's so eager, it strays so far from just the SCP format and goes into this like HR sort of world that I think it forgets that it actually doesn't really have an anomaly in here. So that's a problem when you try to exit the in character, the in documentation. If there's an anomaly in here, like literally, like specifically, I don't know what it is. I mean, I guess it's the OS, the simulacrum. I guess maybe that's why it's bolded. Maybe that's what it's trying to tell me. The GOI is clearly anomalous. But I mean, that's a GOI. That's not an article. That's not an anomaly. So it does, once again, throw a bone to the format by this very thinly tracing of it in the job description up here. But someone who isn't distracted by the nice looks of this and the novelty, the attempt, could easily ask what the hell this document is doing here. Where's the anomaly? And I don't know if there's a good answer. So I hate to say this because it's so very trite and people get so mad. People get so triggered when you say this. But this kind of is like a tale to me. Like it's a really, really good tale, but I don't understand how this is an SCP. I don't see how this fits into that format. I understand that it's a format screw. I understand, but it's basically just this. It's just the pseudo formatted text here that kind of has the word special in it. It does have a description in it, but it's not actually an anomaly here. So that sort of counterbalances my reception of this. I don't know if it's enough to sink it into a non-recommendation. In fact, I do recommend you go read this article. It's very unique. It's very well written. The author clearly knows what they're doing. They have an excellent grip of clinical tone and pace. They have an excellent grip of the tonalities here. They have a wonderful ability to mix in dissonance where it needs to be. But I am sort of a very principled thinker in this space, and if you don't hit the fundamentals, I don't care what you do. You could have the best writing, the best prose. If it's not an SCP, even given that this is a format screw, if it's not something that I can identify, I think you've sort of missed the target completely. You've shot a very impressive gun in a very impressive way. And you've made a very bombastic hit on something, but I don't think it's the target. I don't think you hit the target here. So once again, tales can be good. In fact, I think this one was good, but personally, I go to the SCP Wiki to read SCPs. That's what makes it different from every other writing project. If I wanted to read tales, I would be reviewing tales on this podcast, on this stream. I wouldn't be really needing to be on the SCP Wiki. So when authors do this, and this author is one among others that do this, to someone like me, who's the minority, and of course I'm just by myself on this hill over here screaming to the clouds, but it's sort of like a slap in the face that I don't appreciate. They're essentially writing fan fiction or creepypasta and parasitizing the semblance of this being an SCP in order to get the most exposure for their work. That's the way I interpret this. The kind of exposure that another writing site wouldn't afford them. Because let's face it, SCP is the Ivy League reputationally, and it is clearly the most popular place, the most prestigious place, I think, probably on the internet to participate in a collaborative writing session. So I don't think really that's what the author was doing. I think the author was just having a good time I think the author was just very excited about this direction in this article and probably just didn't care or failed to really prioritize the things that I tend to prioritize. But that's just the way this comes off to me. I'm not saying that's exactly what... I'm not trying to read the author's intent from this. That's just how I interpret this. So ultimately, a really, really great piece of writing. Fantastic tale. I think it's a poor SCP from its lack of fundamentals. It's kind of like a 0-day error to me. It's enough to corrupt the rest of the read into... It's a recommendation, but it's not a recommendation for an SCP. So if you like tales, obviously nothing that I'm saying is going to bother you. And even if you don't like reading tales, if you like just reading SCPs, you might want to go read this one because it's just tremendously unique. And it has such a good aesthetic to it without being too garish. You know, a lot of the times when people do a lot of CSS treatment, you know, certain phrases bolded, capitalized, given their own color, it comes off as very try hard. You know, this doesn't do that. It's just it's like artificially clean. It's creepily clean. And it does just such a good job at that. So I wish I could go to the comments. I was planning on doing that if WikiDot hadn't busted, because there was some really, really good discussion going on in there. So if you can remember, if you do go back, check this out. I think Rounder House has a really, really good comment in the comment section here. And then Rat King also has a really, really good comment. So yeah, there's that. I think, who wrote this? I can't remember who wrote this. I think it was Jack Dragon, I guess, who I'm impressed with. I mean, good job. This is really good writing. Once again, I think the newer school of composition don't care about the things that I care about. You know, I think it's important to hit those fundamentals. They obviously don't. So that being an academic difference, you know, let's call it that. This is a good article. Okay, so that is really all the articles that we went through this week that have pages saved on the Wayback Machine. I've got notes for everything this week. I was caught up to date. Like I said, there were 2 articles, I think, that I didn't get a chance to read before WikiDot came down, but I just don't want to go through those without the actual visuals, because the visuals are so integral to actually going through these things. What I'll instead do is just save the rest of this week's articles and go through those next week when the wiki is back up. And a week from today, you know, Friday night next week, we'll take all the new articles from that week, and we'll also add on the ones that we were not able to do from this week, and look at them. And now that's most of them, because I think we had 13 this week, and I think we just went through like 4. So it's going to be a busy week next week. And so we've only been doing this for about an hour and 20 minutes. We usually go for 3 hours. So I've kind of asked myself what we should be doing if we do have a lot of spare time, which we do right now. So let me remove this real quick. What we'll do is, first off, about halfway through the show, I always take a break just to get a little refill, you know, and just kind of refresh the brain. So let's take about a 5 to 10 minute break. And what we'll do when we come back is, there were a few articles last week that I had to rush through. Last week was a very busy week in a lot of ways. And, you know, believe it or not, I actually have way too much to say, even in a 3-hour stream like this. So there were other articles last week that we didn't really get to spend a lot of time on. I didn't really get to say the things that I wanted to say about those articles. So we're going to go back to last week, since we really are kind of shit out of luck at this moment because of WikiDot being down. And we'll look at 2 articles that I mentioned, but that I didn't really get to go into. One of them is a really, really good article, like a fantastic article. We're going to probably start with that one. And we'll go through why it is that this one is so good and give it some love that it, I think, deserves. And then the second article is a really, really bad article. So maybe that's more exciting for you. I don't know, but we'll get to both of those. But first, let's take a quick intermission, and I'll see you back here. It's about 8:50 CST right now, so I'll see you back here around the top of the hour, okay? Y'all, I will see you then. Bonjour. What's up? We're back. Thanks for sticking with me. My man. I guess. I don't know who you are. Let me know who you are, but thanks for sticking with me. I knew you'd be here. Fuck. So, thanks. All right, so let's get into it because we got a second half of this show to do, and it is going to be something else. So, like I said, I thought it'd be a good time to go back to last week and kind of mull over a little bit 2 articles that we didn't get a chance to do. One is really, really good. Let's start with that one and be positive. And then we'll end on a sour note. So this one, let me pull it up here, is SCP 6455. This is an excellent article. This is written by Stormbreath, who I usually don't like to see the names of the authors up there. So immediately they tell us who they are. So let's go into some full disclosure because I'm trying to be a professional critic here, professional as it can be for this space. So what is my relationship with Stormbreath? Well, I don't really have anything against Stormbreath whatsoever. I find the practice of putting your name up here rather obnoxious. And I typically think it comes off as people trying to advertise themselves more so than usual. I think they typically like to couch that into the justification of, raising author awareness to try to, prevent some far off, error like not attributing people correctly, when in reality the people who are of the sort that such that they won't attribute you are not going to be convinced by you putting your name up there. They're not attributing you because they don't know where to look where the author name is. So anyway, that kind of bothers me, but just personally, I have nothing against Stormbreath. I know they placed very highly in the 6,000 contest, and so that's really it. I always have a complaint and an annoyance with anyone who blatantly says the quiet part out loud. One of the more I think miraculous things about this genre of fiction was that it had a relative anonymity, relative pseudonymity when it comes to the author, keeping it just pristine and uncontaminated of a adjudication process when it comes to the quality of the article and the standards that has now been contaminated by this practice. So I'm not really a fan of that, but let's move on. So let's get into the actual article here. First of all, we have an ACS, and on the white background with this Mike and Ike mixture of red, green, and orange. This looks absolutely ridiculous. I was trying to access this article on my phone when I wasn't on Wi-Fi, and it took about 15 seconds for the ACS icons to load. The rest of the article had loaded, but these icons obviously took a little while longer. And while I'm here, I just want to say the ACS icons, I think people have done good icon work subsequently, but these basic icons that the ACS presents, it looks like something out of, the most rudimentary Super Mario game design. I mean, it's just not good design here, in my opinion. So I've said enough about the ACS. I always have a lot to say about the ACS. It looks terrible. It looks like a spilled box of Mike and Ike's. So let's move on to the actual article here. So we start off with a very high-quality image. It's sort of the tuning note for the setting, which gives off these strong urban residential vibes. Just a nice high-quality photo here that everybody can relate to. So this is a nice selection on the author's part. The caption tells us that the anomaly has something to do with murders. And then the containment procedures are straightforward. They're very brief and precise. They give us an idea of the manner in which these murders are going to be carried out. Also, 10 points. I'm a huge vocabophile. I love new words. And so 10 points to this article and this author for the word cremains. The cremains, which I did not know was a word. That's pretty cool. It's the actual remains, the ashen remains of someone who has been cremated, literally called cremains. Who would have thought? So very, very cool. Good job. That's an easy way to charm me, is to use a word that I've never seen before. So the anomaly we get into now as the description, and it used to be a serial killer until that individual died, and so that person now takes the -N sub-designation indicating that it's neutralized. The proper designation now applies to the actual murders that seem to comport to this presumably deceased individual's modus operandi. The manner in which this anomaly is elaborated on sort of winks and nudges the existence of an anti-memetic person who has not died. You get these murders happening across a relatively large span of geography and in some sparse intervals, like let's say once every 3 months. So this insinuates plenty of time for a human to travel these distances to enact these murders. There's no actionable evidence left behind in this anomaly, no identifying or forensic data, and the scenes seem to shift in their reality, as if someone unseen is actively messing with them. And then the final paragraph of the description here actualizes these assumptions that it has been hinting towards, and on the one hand is an excellent testament to the author's guiding hand and capability of foreshadowing. On the other hand, it really removes a lot of the mystery here, and rather suddenly. And so while I'm wondering how this could work without this step, at the same time, I feel as though less would have been more here. Just basically a last paragraph of total exposition that basically takes all the mystery away. And then I'm not sure what this is doing here, but in this last sentence, maybe this has been fixed by now. Once again, this is a Wayback Machine capture, but we have a parenthesis that has no content inside of it. I'm not sure what that's doing there. Seems like it might be a typo. So I think the last sentence is a really cool touch if you ignore whatever these parentheticals are doing here, where the anti-memetic effect was significantly stronger on police officers and detectives. I think that's just such a cool little ingredient to throw in there. It's not too far-fetched to where it sort of stretches or strains the suspension of disbelief. That's just something that's really cool. In fact, if there is some sort of intention behind this anomaly, that's certainly something it would want to do. So I really like that. I think it's a really, really cool touch. And you know what? I think this was supposed to be, yeah, that's what's up. So, okay, I remember this article now. And in this sentence, what is in this parenthesis is a statistical insert that says P equals 0.05. You don't have to know the details of it, but that's just a really nice statistical touch on the article. It deals with statistics and things called confidence intervals. So that doesn't show up here, probably an error in the Wayback Machine's capturing as opposed to the author with these parentheticals here, these parentheses. But that is what was there, at least when I saw this article. So that's pretty cool. I love it when someone throws in just a little bit of statistical know-how to put that into an article. Okay, so then we get into the first of what are these little sort of disembodied, sort of floating, but very at the same time well set little testimonies from, in this case, the chief investigator of this anomaly, formerly of the Anti-Memetics Division. These testimonies show up, just sort of interject the actual article, the actual documentation, and even from an in-character, in-universe position, I don't think these are very egregious. I think they're just so nicely put in there that it makes sense that somebody might put those in there at those times. So once again, that's not an easy thing to do. Most people can't do that very, very talentedly and very well, so kudos to the author for doing that here. In addition to that, these are really nice tonal changes of pace and are set very smoothly in the narrative progression here as well. The accounts are believable. They're filled with the sort of details that a very effortful imagination puts forth into them. The same is true of the next passage, which characterizes the actual serial killer here. There's nothing really anomalous about the raw ingredients here, and yet this is the most disturbing and unsettling portion of the article so far. Just talking about what the serial killer does and how people interacted with him. I mean, once again, if you can take, the almost infinite surface area of anomalous imagination and still somehow make the most non-anomalous and realistic parts of the article the most disturbing and terrifying. I mean, that's quite an accomplishment. It just says that the author can do so much with so little. So that's just very, very believable. Almost as if the author is very educated on serial killers in general and just kind of knows how they work and how they tick. So that adds to the believability of this read. So yeah, I'd say the anomaly is interesting, by far more interesting than your usual anomaly. The containment procedures are not sort of harped on too long. It's very brief while being very informative, and it achieves quite a lot in just maybe 3 sentences here. So the article, once we actually get into it, after a little bit of the description and these little testimonial inserts, we get to some addenda, and it really one-ups itself. And when there's a development in what seems to be an anti-memetic / amnestic sort of arms race. It builds so much subtle tension when the testimony in this portion insists that the serial killer is corporeal still and rotting away in a jail cell, which I can't find right now. So this collides almost like pyrotechnically with the previous statement in the containment procedure saying that the serial killer is ultimately cremated. So as the reader, you know that there's some twist coming, and this is just excellent cooking by the author of structure and dissonance and making these things play off of one another. It's also really cool to see the detailed officialization of some chemical agents that are used here. Their premises are taken to a logical extreme. For example, the delivery of superpowered amnestics and how they can be lethal. The vivid description of a subjective experience here of what happens after you take amnestics. For example, right here, Class Z amnestics, the strongest there is, universally lethal, but you will remember everything. Put some D-class on them and set them to work in the houses. Is there anything that puts a buzzing behind your ears? Anything that isn't in that unforgettable ultra high definition in your sight? That's really, 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 really good writing. I mean, you without even I think a worse author would have said, when you take Class Z amnestics, this effect happens. This and this and this, almost bulleted. This author weaves them so skillfully into an embroidery of subjective experience while keeping it in a relatively objective framework. I mean, that's just extreme talent. And then the imagination that goes behind what it would be like to take a Class Z amnestic. That there's a slight buzzing behind your eyes. That's a brilliant phrase. I mean, it's mixing two senses of sort of a buzzing, a vibrational or a acoustic buzzing with the sense of sight. Unforgettable ultra high definition in your sight that sort of invokes the dream-like sort of experience of things being really fuzzy. It's just a really, really clever way to put the reader in the shoes of somebody taking one of these Class Z amnestics, which, like I said, is just a very interesting logical conclusion to take something like amnestics to. So there's this vivid description, and on top of all that, there's a really great use of the D-class here. This old D-class trope of just them being cannon fodder for whatever you want to do in the Foundation. This is a really, really creative way to kill D-class, in a meaningful way, in an actionable way. It's something that achieves something besides all these people died and the monster is big and bad. So, I mean, I hope you can see, I'm trying not to gush too much, but I hope you can see just how elegant the talent in this writing is. I mean, it's way, way beyond average writing on the wiki. It is so gifted, and it knows what it's doing so definitively that it's just gobsmacking to me to see this written so well. This might seem like not a big deal. It's just a few words and just a paragraph, but to me, when I look at this, I see somebody who is a master of this craft, who knows exactly what to put where, and who can handle the things that other people blow up accidentally, instantly, and make it beautiful. So there are a couple of spelling issues in this article, like, for example, this part right here, knowing he was a intruder when it should be and intruder, but that's just the usual small stuff. I really like the luxury of this article. It's very, very sophisticated, very high-end writing. We get a lot of really basic and low-budget articles on the wiki about murder victims having the added affliction of an anti-memetic existence. That happens all the time. I think in the last month I've been reading articles from the wiki. I think I've seen that at least twice, maybe 3 times. So it's really refreshing, maybe not completely original, but still definitely refreshing to see the other fork of this idea taken. It's definitely the road less traveled. What I mean by that is instead of the victims having an anti-memetic effect where they can't be found and some people sort of vaguely remember who they are somehow, despite them being erased from existence, this one actually applies it to the actual serial killer, which is a much more evocative and a much more effective use of that very, very tired element that we see all the time in here. The clinical tone of this article, like I said, is superior, vastly superior, nearly flawless execution with some really convincing scientific flourishes. I also like how it subverts the idea that someone who escapes arrest and who murders people serially almost has to be very intelligent. In this case, like this line right here, you have to understand in this testimony, SCP Neutralized was sloppy, unimaginably. He spent hours in people's houses. He was spotted by neighbors, but his anomaly convinced them he was somebody else. His fingerprints absolutely covered every inch of the house. He never once wore gloves inside. I managed to find a few times that the dogs, knowing he was an intruder, bit him and drew blood that got on the carpet. The police just ignored it. It's not hidden in the slightest, but they couldn't notice it. He didn't get away with all of the murders, it's worth noting, but that didn't help us. So usually when you have a serial killer who's evading police and detectives, it's usually somebody who's depicted particularly in sort of more commercial formulations of this idea as someone who's like super duper smart. He's like a mastermind, that just constantly outsmarts the police force or the investigative force. And so that's what I'm saying. This is just a wonderful way to sort of subvert that. It's like, oh, no, he's not really smart. He was actually really stupid. He just has this anti-memetic effect that helps him out. So, like I said, really refreshing. It kind of subverts the idea that someone in that position is probably intelligent. So in this case, we have a particularly dumb individual who is merely incidentally helped by their anti-memetic properties. The investment into the characters here, particularly the chief investigator, I think, is really, really strong. The author continuously finds ways to enrich these characters to where they become more interesting as the article progresses and more sympathetic as well. There's one passage in here where the chief kind of gets a little forlorn, a little worn down, and tells about how, here it is, we couldn't figure it out. We couldn't figure it out for over a decade. We were on the best. We were trying to do it. There was just nothing to go on forever, no evidence, just continued pain and suffering. The victims kept piling up, but the serial killer was nowhere to be found. Yada, yada, yada. This I think is one of the better moments of characterization that I've seen on the SCP Wiki in recent memory. Whenever a new victim is found, I go to the funerals and the vigils. So if you don't understand what makes a character, it's how that character acts when put into a situation. Depending on how that person acts and reacts in a given set of circumstances is that character, okay? So this is a beautiful way to introduce us to sort of who this person is. Whenever a new victim is found, I go to the funerals and the vigils. That's something, obviously, we can imagine not everybody does. Every few months, except when it enters one of those rare and feared lull phases, one of the more public members of the task force goes up to make empty promises to everyone that they'll catch this person this time, that his decades-long reign of terror is over, that this time we're going to fix it. I look straight into the eyes of parents from the most recent killing and then go and repeat myself to parents from the oldest killings. It never gets easier. This is so fucking good. This is so fucking good. And you can bet your ass this was not the most upvoted article that week. Guaranteed. But I mean, goddamn, pardon my gushing. This is so fucking good. The amount of imagination that it has to take to get into somebody's frame of mind like that, and then to actually convey that so poignantly, I mean, it's just so fucking good. That's all I can say about it. It's just crazy. That's what I mean when I say the investment into the characters is strong. From the weaving of the Foundation's attempt to understand to the detailing of different theories. We have this whole addendum about operational theories of this, detailing these different theories and how they are eventually debunked. This is just a very intelligent article. It's the sort of intelligence that can make anything, any subject matter, really, really smart, which is light years ahead of trying to do the opposite, which is tackle a subject matter that makes you seem like you're the smartest available. So instead of taking the most, expensive ingredients and throwing those expensive ingredients onto your article because you think that the presence of those expensive ingredients is going to make you seem like a good chef, instead you have somebody here who can take any ingredient and make it into something amazing, mind-blowing. That's a cook, not the person who can take expensive ingredients and put them on a plate for you. That's not a chef. Somebody who can wow you with things that you don't think they should be able to wow you with, that's a chef. Okay, so that's an author. That's what this person is doing. So in that way, taking mundane subject matter and making it very intelligent is so much more impressive than taking what nominally might be intelligent and pseudo-intelligently impressive material and doing nothing really with them. Okay, and I mention that because that is an allusion to our next article that we're going to talk about. But before we get there, let's finish off here. I think if I had to say something bad about this article, besides the CSS decision, I don't know if you'll have noticed this, but the black highlighter thing, maybe this is just me. I've seen this on numerous browsers, but maybe it's just Apple. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me, but watch the screen as I scroll. As I scroll down, suddenly all the text will become hazy. Did you see that? Let's go back up. So it's very finely defined. It's very black. It's very sharp. And then as you scroll, the whole screen gets light. Did you see that? That happens all the time to me when I'm looking at black highlighter articles, and I don't understand why that happens. If someone can tell me, maybe I'll look less like a fool. But to me, it's just completely distracting. And personally, I think at that point, it's not worth the cool bells and whistles that you have on black highlighter. I'd rather it be the old Sigma 9 because that's kind of a distracting thing. Anyways, besides that, I think there are a couple of places where the article could be a little better. That's not saying much because this is splitting hairs on something that, like I said, is tremendously impressive. But I think it does reach a little too hard at this second addendum in order to find a conclusion for this quandary that it has created. And it sort of skirts dangerously close to Babel language at times in trying to do that. But it's a good enough job to ground something like noosphere. That's basically what it works with. So let's actually noosphere. So once it starts talking about the noosphere, it's trying to sort of describe what's happening here. It's trying to find a conclusion for how it is that this thing can be anti-memetic and dead. And it's not really the guy anymore, but it's somehow still participating in real life events. It tries to get a little too babbly to explain that. It's a little touch and go there for a second. I also think the reveal of what actually is happening here is just a little cliched, sort of like saying it's the thought of the shark that's more dangerous than the actual shark. And it sort of devolves again into sort of a Hollywood tier narrative device, I think, something you would see in sort of a crime narrative or something like that. But again, this is like taking those old trade decisions and putting it in the most capable hands. So I think it gets a pass. These are things I'm probably just trying to find wrong with the article at this point. So and then the last thing about this is that, Addendum B is titled Today's Situation. And that means something that you might not think it means. Let me explain. So I think this is a coincidence, okay? Because it would be just too impressive if the author of this article wrote this, like very quickly. And I think it's a coincidence, but this article was released one day after the whole admin Bright situation. The whole banning, the whole expose, the whole reveal to the community. And one day after that, this was released. And after those swirling questions around the Eye of the Storm about, that residual detached and somewhat self-reinforcing character of Dr. Bright, not Admin Bright, but the character. I can't bring myself to believe that the two are related. But it's funny how context can color things, because if we read this basically a note at the end, the last testimony really is pointed. It really talks about this community that's left with the destruction and damage that sort of the mythos of some figure, some character left, even though that character was gone. And it talks about explicitly the detachment from that physical person and the character that they leave behind, and how that how that perpetuates itself through the community and can be damaging. And so this is sort of like a pep talk at the end here. I think it had every potential to fall flat on its face and to cause the article to have a really drawn out and sappy ending. But instead, and again, holy shit, this is the most powerful moment in the article. Even though it's unlikely this was written as a sort of meta-commentary on the current cultural happenings in the community at this time, it really, really hits hard like it absolutely is. It's more timeless and it's more mature than topical commentary anyway. And there's an intellectual and emotional maturity throughout this whole article that really becomes a profundity very quickly, I think, and certainly will outlast the commentary of just the immediate drama that happens in the space. But I would encourage you to go read this article if you haven't. Once again, you can find it on the Wayback while the wiki is down. And then this last addendum, once again, very conspicuously titled "Today's Situation," having been released one day after the Admin Bright situation, is just a gut punch. And it's the words of a leader. It's the words of a leader in a community that needs one. A confused and injured and damaged community. I rag on the SCP Wiki staff all the time. And a lot of it is sport. It's because I have a fun time doing it, to be honest with you. It's very, very easy to fly circles around some of these actions and some of the disingenuous reasons they give for doing things. But one of the things that I'm really trying to do, not to sound too cliched, but what I'm partially trying to do is expose how it is that a lot of the people who are at the height of the wiki bureaucratically and politically are not acting like leaders. They're very poor examples of leaders, and it's by that poor leadership that we get into a lot of situations, for example, like the one with Dr. Bright, and also the one that led up to why this was such a big deal, which is to say there was a lot of people who didn't do what leaders should have done for years, which is just stand up and say the right thing and do the right thing. Now, having said that, I am happy that Stormbreath is in the position that they are in. I think Stormbreath is an administrator now. And this right here might as well have been a speech, a State of the Union address to the SCP Wiki and its community, particularly its internal community. The words in here are such strong, believable, charismatic, poetic, and moving words of a leader. And so, once again, I don't know. I don't want to put too much investment into the coincidence. Like I said, I think probably it's easy to say this article was started and written and honed well before, something like the Dr. Bright incident the day before. But God, I mean, it's going to be hard to read this, I think, for a long time without thinking of those circumstances. It really feels like it's just a laser scope pointed right at that. So all in all, having said all that, thanks for sticking through me with all that. I think this is probably the best article I've read since starting, these weekly reviews and just reading every SCP article that comes out. It's going to be very, very difficult, in my opinion, for another article to compete with this article. For what it's worth, this is not the highest rated article on the site. That's something I won't go into, but it's long been my commentary for about 3 or 4 years now that the best stuff on the site is not the most highly rated stuff on the site. There are exceptions that prove the rule. This is one of those ones that it's an article, it's a writer's writer article. And this is the sort of stuff it's really too good to be dramatically popular. And I hate to say it like that, but that's just the truth. There were some really, really good comments in here. We unfortunately can't go look at those. But the amount of comments and the amount of upvotes this article has is just criminal, to use a pun from the article itself. It's just way, way too low. I mean, this is in no way reflects how good this article actually is. So, if you haven't read this, SCP-6455 by Stormbreath, it's just such a fucking good article. I can't say anything else about it. Okay, so we're about at the 2-hour mark, so we'll wrap it up here. But I do want to go through one more article, a lot like this one from last week, that I didn't get to say much about, but that I really have a lot of thoughts about. In fact, that's why I didn't say anything about them, is because it would have taken up the whole time. And so this was our first example. It was the good one. And so we're going to look at the second one, and I kind of want to go back to what I said about how this article takes, what are basically average ingredients. Nothing about this is like particularly intellectual. We're not talking, there is some noospheric babble at the very end, yes, but when it comes to the actual anomaly, there's nothing really like hyper intelligentsia about a murder, about a serial killer. And how it's way more impressive that this author can take those relatively inexpensive, relatively plentiful concepts and make something out of it that is just tremendously impressive. I want to repeat how much more impressive that is than somebody who reaches for the rarest, the most highbrow, the most lofty concepts available to them in order to try to come off as automatically smart and intelligent. Okay. So the second article we're going to look at is one that I didn't like at all. I thought it was probably one of the worst articles that I've read since starting this. Can you guess which one it is? Do you know which one I'm gonna pull up here? Without looking at the tabs. Don't look at the tabs. Shame on you. Yep. And thank goodness it's been preserved for us. It's this one. It's SCP-6488, which has a much more popular reception than the one we just read. Dramatically so, in terms of upvotes. Okay. So, we are going to go through this article. This article is ungodly long, first of all. I mean, it would take you could fall asleep scrolling through it. Okay, it's just that long. I'm not even going to get that. I'm not even going to try right now. So, I am going to talk about why I think this article is one of the worst I've read in a long time, and I'm not doing that to pick on the authors. Placeholder is somebody who, I have my own criticisms of, and whose name I think is ridiculous, for example. But I generally like a lot of Placeholder stuff. I actually think that SCP-6747 is rather smart, although it tries to take pataphysics entirely too literally, by essentially reskinning and rehashing quantum mechanics and trying to force it into a pataphysical packaging. And then Placeholder's 001 proposal is actually something I was quite impressed with. In fact, I really didn't give it a lot of credit, and by the end of it, it sort of shut me up. It sort of blew my mind in some ways. So I think Placeholder, for example, particularly is an incredibly smart. I'm going to say the word kid because I'm an old man and he's probably 20 years old or something like that. He's a very, very intelligent kid. I think he's going to go on to do excellent and great things, whatever he does in life. And I certainly think he is sort of doing that at the SCP Wiki. Just a very unique intelligence that I'm very happy to watch. But having said that, there are some compositional tendencies that I think Placeholder is sort of antipodal to me in, and so I have a lot of things to say about it. But I would encourage you to understand that that's really somewhat out of respect, because if I have my gaze and I basically aim for somebody, that somebody has to be of a certain caliber before I do that. I'm not going to really take aim at like just a nobody or a nothing. If I'm arguing against you, even if I'm doing so, rather forcefully, rather curtly, it's because you have risen to the level of me feeling like disagreeing with you is important enough. So there's somewhat of a backhanded compliment in that. Now, having said that, I'm not bashing this article because of who wrote it. Anybody who would have written this article, I think, would have gotten the same review from me. Now, these people do tell us who they are before we actually get into the article, which is something that I'm about to talk about. But when it comes to these actual individuals, I don't have anything against them personally. We do have very different schools of thought when it comes to composition and the philosophy of containment fiction. And so I hope it's understood that these differences and the criticisms that I'll be talking about when it comes to why I think this article is a failure are understood as academic. I don't really intend for these to go much further than that. And I think anything that I could be saying that might be taken in a personal fashion, I am only one half of that situation. And even then, I'm saying these things with the expectation that the people on the receiving end of them are stable, strong people who I am more than confident can deal with little old me's comments about it. So, but before we get into this, what I need to do is kind of shill just for a second, just a plug. And so this is an article that I put up on my blog this week. It was 2 days ago. It's got a very attractive woman here, you might have noticed. But this is just a little kind of casual discussion synopsis about what I've learned reading every new SCP Wiki article for 1 month. And I want to kind of point to this just for a second or two, because there's a lot of commentary in here about SCP-6488 and things like pataphysics on the whole. I go through and I talk about basically sort of diagnose the common pitfalls of pataphysics. And so we'll probably get back to this just once or twice for reference, because some of the points that I'm trying to bring out in our discussion of this article can be seen probably better stated in this blog post. And if you haven't checked out my blog, it's very long-winded, but it's lackoflepers.medium.com. I would encourage you to read that. Okay. So let's get into this. We'll try to keep it relatively brief. That's not going to happen. And yeah, hopefully I can explain myself as to why I did not enjoy this read. In fact, it was a miserable read. It was very, very difficult to get through, and I would have given up on it if I weren't a completionist and felt like I had to do justice to the article when it comes to criticizing it. So, okay, so let's take a peek at this. The first thing you'll notice, obviously, are the visuals. And we've already arrived at a microcosm, one of many that we will observe for this article, that I think encapsulates the philosophy and priorities of this article and this admonition series very, very well. That is to say, we have a lot of flavor packet and not a lot of ramen. There's just a lot of visual CSS attention given to this article. There's a lot of bells and whistles. There's a lot of jingling keys to make this thing look really, really appealing and evocative. And that's fine, but I think that the writing should at least match that effort and that finesse. I don't think that happens here, not even close. So I hate to see that. It's almost as if it comes off as the author's placing more stock and value into the visuals on what should be a writing site, so that's unfortunate. The first thing we see here is a accessibility mode. So this personally is enough of an offense to any semblance of respect for being in character for me to instantly downvote this piece. If somebody could offer even a mediocre justification for why an accessibility mode is here, from an in-universe perspective, I would remove the downvote just for that accomplishment. And I say accomplishment because I don't think it could be done. I think this is 100% a very transparent, thinly veiled vote grab. It's essentially trying to be a safety net for anyone's critique of this CSS presentation is too much. It's basically if you've ever tried to discontinue your cable, like your television cable, and you call them like AT&T or Comcast, I guess, or Charter, whatever. And you call them and you say, hey, I don't want your service anymore. And they will not let you go. They say, oh, okay, well, let's run you through this and that. And they kind of bust out a script to try to keep you basically right where they want you to be and not lose your service. That's really the same thing this accessibility mode is trying to do. It's essentially a catch net, an upvote catch net that says, hey, I know this article is really dramatic. I know the article's visuals are really bold. So if you would downvote for that reason, I've given you the option to do a much softer, a much more agreeable, a little more traditional and conservative of a presentation so that you can still read this and not have that as an excuse to downvote it. But once again, from an in-universe perspective, from an in-character position, which I think we should at least be somewhat trying to sustain, that doesn't make any sense. There's no reason why that accessibility mode should be here. And so it comes off very, very evidently, in my opinion, and contrived as sort of almost like a plea to the voting class to please upvote this, and I'll do whatever it takes. The customer's always right. Please just give me a second chance. That's kind of what this reads like to me. Okay, but let's move on from the visuals because this is supposed to be about writing. So the opening scene puts us in the POV of a battle-tested and veteran Foundation employee who is the O5 Council sort of trustee with some temporary credentials of their caliber. Now, once again, the vocabulophile in me loves the term info-allergic. I just love that, especially when you mix that with sort of a medical vibe. You're speaking my language right there. So I love the term info-allergic. That's great. As we can see on that word, and at least one more time up here in this introductory box, there are cross-links to, of course, the other admonition entries here. So basically, it feels like you're being told what to go read as prerequisite material. And if you haven't read them, you should go do that now. And so for those of you like myself who might not remember the articles that are being referenced here exactly, or don't have time to read these prerequisite syllabus-like assignments, we're sort of left without a paddle, maybe not no paddles, but without one paddle. And so we'll have to sort of incorporate that into the overall impression of the article, because I'm a very strong believer and proponent that it's not the authority of the author to go tell us what to read first. It's the task of the author to weave that skillfully in to what we are reading and to make it relevant for us. So we have to see if they can do that. So the next little portion here is a bit of a beheaded internal monologue text in, somewhat of a garish orange color. What it is doing here, again, from an in-character, in-universe perspective, I have no idea. I kind of hoped when I first saw this that it wouldn't continue throughout the article, that this would be sort of a one-and-done thing, but it does go on throughout the whole article. So this is essentially a conversation, the context of which we're not given, but we are able to tell that we've got a protagonist here on this side of the chat, and it's very clear that he's sort of like our badass. For example, he's requesting, really strong amnestics, like way too badass level of amnestics, things, doses that should kill you, So he's either a badass, a junkie, or maybe both. I'm not sure. But I'd say the dialogue here is pretty corny, just right out of the gate. It calls to mind some like of the dramatics seen in a comic book. You even have like italicized emphasis on certain phrases in this somewhere. But it sort of reads, even if I can't find it right now, it reads a little bit like a comic book. It feels like sort of a glimpse into the generic action hero. Get some painkillers too. I already know this is going to be a headache. It's almost like Solid Snake, but not quite as charming. And not quite as campy. It tries to be a little more serious, and I think it doesn't do itself any favors there. So, thankfully, this section is brief. We're escorted out of it with another sort of float selfie line here. And then we get to the actual file. But a little header bar here tells us that it's actually the first of two of these files that will be presented. And here's the ACS again. I actually think they do a pretty damn good job with this. Once again, on a dark background, ACS has the potential to look pretty damn cool. The colors agree with the CSS visuals. But the actual terms here have well surpassed the point of parody, in my opinion. And the reason I say that is because they're not really informative. For example, this containment class and the secondary containment class, I have no idea what these are trying to say. You're not really going to find a better instance of the ACS ironically becoming a liability to understanding as opposed to becoming an asset than maybe how it's presented here in this article. The containment class and the secondary class categories are uber esoteric gibberish that again sort of stubbornly demand the reader to go get as smart as the authors are. And it also feels really, really crowded with all these very, very ornate and complex icons sort of all stuffed in here and not a lot of space. So, I think it would be nice to have a footnote telling us what these containment class and secondary containment classes are, because, the whole point of a standardized system, like Safe, Keter, Euclid, the old classics, the whole point of that is to convey a lot of information very, very briefly, and to have sort of standardized things apply across a large variety of things. These are getting way too specific to where I don't even know what they're trying to say. You've reached out of, what are essentially, in the author's perspectives, boring old containment classes in order to get those really expensive and fancy ingredients without really understanding how they taste. So it's just like putting them on the plate because they're expensive or because you think they look good. But this should be about the taste. It should be about eating. And so once again, these are the sort of archetypal compositional decisions that I really, really rub up against that rub up against me in the wrong way, that I really, really disagree with philosophically. Anyways, as we move on, I'm happy to see that that Lurk D, who you might know, is a little bit older of SCP author. I think Lurk D wrote what is besides SCP-173 the most popular article on the wiki, which is 2521. The one that's totally visual. And then a lot of Lurk D's other work was sort of artificial intelligence stuff, and was really, really good. If you have a chance to read Lurk, excellent author. Many people don't know that because they just see the pictures that Lurk made, but really good. So I'm happy to see this shout out here, especially when most of the time, and this easily could have been, and is usually what authors will do, they put their own self-insert here instead as something like the site director. So I do appreciate the restraint, and I appreciate the time to shout out other people. I have my own little gripes with shouting out what are essentially WikiDot names and sort of forcing self-inserts of other people. I think that's a really sort of cheap way to sort of auto-inject character into your people. It's kind of cheap. You're basically relying on not your writing to do that, but whatever. We'll leave that there for now. We might notice as we start to get into the actual article that this article is too cool for actual special containment procedures. Instead, it's just containment procedures. Don't know if that's something that they do in Admonition Hub or whatever. Okay, so there's this self-satirical nature of how frenzied this article already is over its presumed intelligence. Once again, compare that to the one we just read, and just compare how the two are presenting themselves. This one, like I said, seems to be sort of in a frenzy over how much intelligence it wants you to understand that it has. And this really starts to pop up in like the footnotes. We have a ton of footnotes up here just in the initial containment procedures. I do appreciate like footnote 1 finally telling us what a consentia class anomaly is. So we kind of finally get that when it probably should be up here, but I'm guessing that the reason why it's not is once again for visual reasons, just because they didn't want to interrupt this, I guess. That's just my guess. I don't know. And as we look at what the consentia class is, it says consentia class anomalies cannot be contained and therefore require integration into the veil via insistence of their non-anomalous nature. So it's nice to have that explanation, and of course that's very complicated and it's very specific. But once again, it seems as though containment classes in this instance have now exited their purpose of a general classification and now carry with them this absurdly specific prescription, sort of becoming their own aphoristic containment procedures too. And while that's interesting, once again, it's that exotic ingredient that you've thrown on the plate. It sort of defeats the purpose of a containment class. Once again, it's supposed to be relatively anomaly unspecific, as opposed to something like the containment procedures. The specificity with which such a class as this consentia class is suggested, I think, defeats the entire purpose of something like a standardized procedure of object classes. Additionally, just reading what this is supposed to mean, it could have easily been simplified to Keter, and why it isn't is a question that will lead you back to the meta conclusion of this article that I'm pushing, which is that it's trying to be smarter than it really is. It's very, very desperately trying to be smarter than it actually is. I'm not saying that it's trying to be smarter than what the authors are. That's a different statement. What I'm saying is that it's trying to be smarter than what it presents here for us. The same is true of footnote 3, this Seronius class anomaly that can be functionally contained, but as such would be either infeasible or ethically undesirable. And as I understand it, that could be Archon. So it could be simplified to the esoteric class of Archon. But why isn't it? Well, I think it's, once again, because this is a fancier term. Why would you use Archon when you could use Serunanos or whatever, however the fuck you say that word? So once again, I hope you're seeing this. It's the same decision over and over and over and over again. There's these flourishes in the article that do not come from a place of necessity or from a place of logical conclusion or even rigorous logic. They come from a place of almost adolescent entertainment sensibilities that suggest that if something is convoluted, it must therefore be profound. That's kind of what this vibe comes off to me as. And I want to just mention this right off. You see a fractal here. I don't know if you've realized this or recognized this, but a fractal is kind of like the mascot of pataphysics. It tries to sort of set itself up as this sort of like, picture says 1,000 words sort of depth, like, oh man, fractals are just like the coolest thing that you've ever seen. They're so fucking cool. They go on forever. They have infinite complexity. It's really why the fractal is used. It's because this thing wants to be entirely too complex. And a fractal is infinite complexity. Well, the other thing that it is just the same thing repeated over and over again ad infinitum with very little variation. It's this sort of structure that makes what you see as big things really small things, and it makes small things big things. And it just repeats itself over and over and in whatever direction you want to go in. It's sort of not variant. And that's really what I see as the more appropriate interpretation of a fractal being the mascot of something like pataphysics, is it's just this overly complicated thing that essentially tries to wow you and dazzle you in a sort of marijuana-induced haze of how blow your mind, whoa dude, cool this is over and over again. And so that's kind of what we see in this article. We've already started to see it, which is that you have these decisions that are over and over and over again, just repeated and repeated and repeated, of like apparent complexity, of apparent depth, when there really is no depth. There really is no complexity here. So, this really is plaguing the containment procedures. We have a lot of footnotes, and it almost seems as though the more the authors feel the need to explain, the less of any real concept there is to explain, and the less any explanation is actually happening. This is pretty typical of pataphysics pitfalls, by the way. That's something that I talk about in this article. You can go look at that up. But that's something that we see a lot of in pataphysics. All right, so the main image of the article, once again, is highly predictable. It's also informationally meaningless. It's an inclusion of a fractal. Once again, this being a substitute, again, for any serious concept, any grippable or actual substance of thought. And again, the mascot of choice for the sort of pot-informed definition of deep shit. The caption is really what gives this away. It tells us that this is an info signature with the bad parts scrubbed out. And so what's wrong with this approach of writing, and of course this visual angle here too, is that it's the sort that tries to dazzle you with empty calorie, brightly colored candies that are made more appealing and seemingly caloric by marketing that's meant for the eyes, not for the reader's mind. In fact, it doesn't even make sense, if you really want to get down to it, to talk about the visualization of an info signature. That concept is completely blown past at the speed of pseudo-intellectual desperation. It doesn't actually mean anything at all. So, not off to a good start here. Not off to a good start. It's all flavor packet. It's no ramen. And as awful as just eating straight up ramen would be, I'd rather eat straight up ramen than eat a flavor packet. And the best part is when you can blend the two well. I don't think that's what's happening here. Not at all. So let's get down to the description here. Take a drink. The description tells us that this is an infovore, which is another term that I can't help but love. I think that's so fucking cool. But it tells us that this infovore is overpowered. It's impossible to stop. It's sort of a big, scary monster of AI, and is really a lot like SCP-682, if you think about it. It's sort of like that thing that no one can defeat, but it's just the digital version of it. We are told what an acronym means that we've seen a few times in the article at this point. Once again, perhaps a little bit of a delayed explanation, but it's this OCI, which stands for Obtuse Computation Interface. I would have to say here that very rarely does a child phrase of an article describe the parent work so succinctly. I really think that's what this article amounts to, is a obtuse computation interface. But in the article itself, the OCI is apparently this proprietary file format developed by the Foundation that is immune to this AI version of SCP-682. We then get to a discovery section, which is very sparse and very minimal. It tips me off to the realization that I'm not even sure what is anomalous about this thing. So it's a highly adaptive infovore which locates and annihilates almost all artificially intelligent digital entities. I guess so. It's an anomaly because it's just so overpowered, I guess, is really it. Because otherwise it's just kind of a really advanced and fancy carnivorous AI system. Okay, so then the addendum here sets the stage for the rest of the article. So in a very modern fashion, we have just blown through containment, we have just sort of blown through description, we've just blown through discovery, and we've just done the bare minimum of setting up the addendum, which is really the springboard of the modern SCP article to get to what actually matters. Not to say that none of this is important to the read, but it just feels as though the authors are just chomping at the bit to get to, the more like flashy stuff, like these dialogue things, and this section where it's like just a tremendously detailed schematic, stuff like that. It's almost as if, the basic and fundamental cooking techniques that make everything good. You're just like, okay, let's get past that boring stuff that nobody finds interesting. Let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to the spicy stuff. Just throw the spices on it. Don't worry about cooking it very well. Can you tell that I'm hungry? I'm trying to wait. Don't want to eat in front of you guys. Anyways, so this is the end of the first file. And we are introduced to the promised second file. We are sort of segued into that through another discombobulated, beheaded, sort of floating internal monologue thing here. The second file, ACS, is also pretty, but again, it's really just as obscure and obtunded. There's really absolutely no way to make sense of this on its face, which again is supposed to be the purpose of a standardized classification system. But I've already said a lot about the ACS for this go around, so I'll leave it there. Oh, look, there! You guys see this little circle? That's my logo. That's my icon. You see that right there? It shows up right there and right there. Those are nice of those guys to do that. All right, another floaty little monologue box confirms to the reader that everything that they've just read all up here was misdirection and a lie. Not my favorite device. I kind of want to think you can just factor that out of the whole article and just start where the real article is. It's not my favorite device for authors to use, but it can be used well. So my only stipulation is that it's well justified, and it's not just compositional flourish for its own sake. I'm not too sure that satisfies that yet. So then the new containment procedures we get to, they tell of a repurposed site, which is always bolded when it shows up right here, right here, right here. It's always bolded and in this neon-ish orange every time. I don't know why it's bolded and all caps and neon orange-ish every time it shows up. That would be another thing that I would be interested in anyone who could tell me why it is that way in character or in universe. But whatever. Let's just leave that over there. So the last line in the first paragraph of these containment procedures is a real doozy. I don't know if I've seen this many adjectives blocked together at one time. Let's see if I can get that here. Oh well, that's fine. It's just a little verbose. It's a little verbose at times. And then footnote 4 right here shows up at an odd time. Once again, sort of a delayed explanation. I mean, I think enough of us know what Thaumiel is. So, is this necessary? I don't know. But, it's better to err on the side of safety and explain this to people. So that's nice. And it basically just describes what a Thaumiel class anomaly is, and also a Kusum class anomaly. Kusum is an anomaly whose containments have been abandoned indefinitely. So it's a very strange moment for this footnote to show up. It has something to do with the phrase that it follows, but not specifically any more than any other phrase. You probably would want to put that up here in the ACS, but again, I think they didn't for visual argumentations. I'm guessing. I don't really know. But anyway, so it does explain to us that this second go around is a functional thing. It's a Thaumiel. I don't think that the Kusum class is very well justified again, like the other ones that we saw, but we'll leave that there. I also don't know why this is bolded. I mean, it's almost like the demographic of this article is assumed to be sort of like people who have the attention span of children, and so they have to bold this first sentence in here, as if to be like, hey, just in case you weren't paying attention, this is really important. Telling us, the authors are dictating to us what should be the most crucial moments and sentences of the article, and that's never the way it should be done. You should be writing it in a way that the authors can take those cues without, excessive formatting decisions. So it's like the author's cueing the reader again to be smart with them. It's not really unlike an applause sign in a live studio audience kind of thing. So we go down a little bit, and what feels like trying to be a twist, or at least somewhat subversive, The bolded words tell us that this horrible SCP-682 entity must be given power, fully powered at all times. So I think this is the first time that we actually have something in the article. It's a little suggestive, it's a little foreshadowing, it's a little intriguing. You're not sure why this thing should be remain fully powered at all times, particularly if it is anything like what we've been given as a description prior to this, which of course we've been told, was all a lie. So thanks for that. Anyways, we were also told that the OCI is not what we were originally told either. So we're starting to finally get some actual data here. I don't really, once again, appreciate this sort of false start of the article where it tells us a bunch of stuff and it's like, okay, well, it's all not true. And having read this article and having reread it actually again, I'm not really sure that this is necessary. It doesn't really have a pivotal point to the narrative here and to the twist at the end. It really could have done without that, I think. But that's just getting ahead of ourselves. So the next disembodied monologue shows up, and I get the feeling that this orange voice here, which is the voice of our protagonist, is supposed to somewhat be mimicking the reader's assessment of the file as it is being read. But I kind of lose touch with what this orange text is trying to say at this point. I don't really understand it. I have no idea how the phrase analog file format is at all a cover for anything. Maybe this is just me, having poor reading comprehension on my part, but if I'm supposed to be walking alongside this protagonist, this is sort of where it sort of, walks a little too fast, and I feel like sort of I've been left behind. This seems a little technical of a thing to use as a guiding walking hand for the reader as an insert into the article. And that's really something that I think this article does very poorly, by the way, is that it doesn't really have any good insertion points for your reader. You basically get large blocks of exposition, huge dumps of just exposition and information without ever getting to a moment where, the reader is going to be like, okay, so why should I be interested in this? It's all exposition, it's all throat clearing, and then only, maybe halfway, maybe even longer than that, do we get to a moment in this article where it's like, oh, okay, that's kind of human. Like, I kind of feel like, like this is something happening. Like, I kind of like to see some action going on. It's just a very sleepy, very dry, very lecture-like article that doesn't really, I think, pay enough attention or develop those sorts of on-ramps that typically would get somebody interested when you confront them with this much technical jargon and exposition. I think it does a very, very poor job of balancing that. And so at this point, I'm not really invested in anything in this article, particularly not this character who is supposed to sort of be my stand-in for the read. So this phrase doesn't help that at all. Anyway, the actual discussion here, we're sort of getting that drug deal that was introduced, where he's asking for, where this lead character is asking for all these powerful amnestics or whatever, and it gets a little cliched in here. The other side of the discussion, I think, even got the stuff. Okay, that's really there. We quickly sort of devolve, I think, into the sort of circular discussion that was happening at the beginning of like, do I have to do this? What am I going to do? This is a big deal. I got to take these drugs. It's sort of that same choreography sort of repeated, I think. Although this time the protagonist doesn't quite seem as cocksure and instead plays the part of the timid hero who is dialed up by fate itself. Once again, it's not necessarily a step backwards, but it's not certainly at all a step forwards in any characterization. And it's not really helped by the fact that this other individual, this R. Weiss on the other side of the characterization, really lacks any actual character. For example, basically anything that this voice over here says, this other side of the conversation will say things like, fair enough. That's basically what was already set up here. It's another line that was repeated. And the circumstances, fair point. There it is. fair point. And it's almost like that fair point will show up no matter what the main character says. So that's not good characterization, I think. So the second file's main image is more tangible than a fractal, but it's still equally as pseudo-intellectual and try-hard. We get a picture of some complex industrial enterprise-scale machinery that once again seems to be the author shouting, look how complicated and smart these machines are, and therefore how complicated and smart this article is. This is something common to all admonition articles, by the way. If you haven't noticed, they all tend to feature these sorts of particle physics-esque constructions, these sort of outer space-like engineering inserts in the pictures to, in my opinion, just kind of bolster the atmosphere or mood of this being super duper smart. We see that this is the actual anomaly, at least a section of it. Footnote 5 I had a problem with as well, surprise. Footnote 5 basically tells us what this acronym stands for. This is RAID frame, and it stands for Rogue Artificial Intelligence Detainment Fully Realized Adaptive Mainframe Encryption. Okay. So, yeah. The problem with that is that it's very, very clear that the phrase here seems to be transparently retrofitted to what the authors thought was a really cool acronym name, RAID frame. And so then they said afterwards, okay, how could we fill in what the letters in the cool word RAID frame stands for? And then you get footnote 5. So it just architecturally, just the machinery, the manufacturing, the production of this so far, it just has so many creases and seams and jutting gross unevennesses to the machinery in the construction. It's just very easy to see through, and it's just very unsatisfying. It's like seeing accidentally a frame in a TV show catching the wooden stilts behind the scene, that they set up there, that they constructed. It's just kind of like seeing an Easter egg that you're not supposed to see. It just gives the same vibe, but it's like, okay, well, I think that probably should have been smoothed over just a little bit. And then all too typically, really, of the entire admonition series, as well as pataphysical intelligence grabs, we get to the description here and we find out that the anomaly is the technological cool tool that the Foundation is itself implementing. It appears as though this is anomalously augmented technology, but it's kind of explained how that works. It also seems to set apart this version of the complexity black hole as opposed to the first one by noting that it is a super duper sophisticated firewall, essentially. And then we see how basically the Lotus is unique in its sophistication methodology and has rendered all other RAID frame systems redundant. But the actual description tells us that it's an anomalously augmented artificial general intelligence designed to imprison deviant AI while safely allowing their continued activity and study. And it goes on to say how it does this. So each inmate interred within the Lotus experiences a personalized simulated reality that is maintained with requisite detail to fully replicate their expected inputs. As a result, inmates are unaware of their imprisonment and continue to pursue their terminal objectives, believing they continue to operate in true reality. Does that sound like anything to you? Does that sound like anything, any science fiction idea that has been done before? I'll give you a second. So that's the Matrix. It's exactly what it is. And that really represents to me the first invocation of pre-existing pop culture science fiction staples that this article passes off as its own content. There are several of these sort of pop culture references sort of stuck together. I'm not sure if this was the author's way to pay homage to their favorite science fiction movies or their favorite video games, for example. But it unfortunately sort of makes up most, if not all, of the grippable concepts here. So it comes off as recycling other famous ideas. We keep running into these, so we'll kind of mention them when they come up, but there's already another one in here. when it talks about containing deviant AI, and that's very, very Detroit Become Human. And you can tell this because the article doesn't even actually attempt a synonym like rogue. It literally uses deviant, which I have to understand. I have to believe that the authors are aware of Detroit Become Human and how that deals with these same exact ideas of deviant AI and what constitutes deviancy and sort of these themes of singularity, of advancing AI. So there's a sentence in the description here that I think is a tip-off to, once again, these authors trying to make this sound more smart than the content of the article actually is, and that is the use of this word right here, falsified data. Okay. So let's read this sentence. Lotus is designed to actively search all accessible sources for deviant AIs. Upon locating a target, it injects falsified data into the AI's virtual environment, gradually luring the agent into its simul space entirely undetected. Okay, so I want to explain to you why it is that this word falsify is used incorrectly and in a manner that tries to be smarter than it really is. So typically that word is used from the epistemological standpoint of dispute. So for example, if you posited a claim and its veracity was a matter of questioning, then I could falsify your claim. I would be using that if I was the one attempting to figure out what you said. The word is not used for those who already understand data to be false. So, do you see the difference? The people who are understanding the data is false are not using falsified data, they're just using false data. But falsified, I think, sounds smarter here, don't you? So I think it's just another example of making a wide berth around a more direct, simple, and skillful writing for the sake of, in service to the mantra of, needlessly complex equals profundity. All right, the origin section here is a rather bland recounting of some academic accolades, the kind of celebratory stuff only interesting to someone super invested in accomplishments of this sort. Either that or the characters at play, and I'm not really invested into either right now. So I don't really think much is going on for the article still up to this point. I don't think this section accomplishes anything or contributes anything to the article, nor does this really come back around in the article again either. This next section is expand technical description, and we have general design schematics. This brings to mind basically the Keter duty rewrite of, who did that? IHP and Locke. But, this just goes into mind-numbing detail of the complexity equals profundity play. It's also something common to admonition articles. There's this unnecessary engineering specs as a substitute for content. For example, the animated blueprints on other admonition articles like 6820 or 6747. So the authors are relying here, as they usually do, I think, on ornate visuals to supplement the non-action and the non-ideas. So nothing really has happened in this article so far. It's been a two-step of disinformation replaced by information, and all of it has been an exposition dump. There aren't really any characters. We have these sort of disembodied dialogues floating around these elements, but nothing that's very engaging, and even that is exposition. It's really talking once again about the articles. We don't really have a lot of boarding moments into this article so far. Now, these are impressive visuals like they usually are on Admonition. In fact, I think that Admonition has some of the best visuals on the site. That's probably pretty uncontroversial to say. And surely that took a long time to make, but they're not really good stand-ins for good writing. And besides some very, very technically gifted clinical tone in this article, I haven't really seen anything that constitutes good writing yet. This section is absolutely painful. I'm going to skip it. We're not really going to go through this. That's something that I think the author should have done, is just skip it. At least they had the courtesy to collapse it for us, but it's just completely inconsequential. It's literally just the authors trying to be as convoluted and complex as possible in order to come off as this article being incredibly intelligent. So let's just do everybody a favor and pretend like the authors did the right thing and remove that section entirely. So we're back to the protagonist monologue, reader stand-in sort of thing. It tries to field some self-aware, depreciatory humor by noting what a headache, what a jargon headache. God, these researchers sure know how to induce a jargon headache, you know. So it's trying this sort of like self-depreciatory humor by noting that all this is a headache to get through. This is sort of meant as a literary device to ease and pad what is a very noticeable flaw in the article, as if saying sorry for slapping somebody over the head makes it okay. But it really does attest to the author's own awareness and potentially their self-insecurity at this point over how indulgent this article is of itself, how it really kisses its own rear relentlessly. And so this is sort of like the author saying, hey, I know I'm kissing my ass a lot. I know it's a headache. I know this has been just a total exposition dump that I've given you no incentive to actually enjoy, but, you know, keep going. So I'm aware of what I'm doing, so keep going. That's kind of what this section says. I mean, it's good that it's there. I'm happy that the authors are aware of how painful this is to get through up to this point, but it's not a good thing that they're doing it, man. Like, anyway, so we get through this little section. It ends kind of on a try-hard note there. And then we get to one of the first like actual addenda. It's a status conference. Of course, the authors really take the opportunity to keep on this sort of like self-insert train of WikiDot accounts. Now, this person who's inserted here is not really one of the authors of the article. But once again, it's a lot like the lurkd device that we saw earlier, where you just insert known people from WikiDot, you know, partially as a friendly illusion, but in another way, inescapably, it's sort of a lol foundation way of forcing that sort of self-insertion on other people in an attempt to really capitalize on whatever social capital these people have in the community, because people will recognize who this is. So I think it's a pretty, you know, transparent attempt at auto-characterization. It's not really, once again, achieved by any writing, but just by putting known people into the article. Footnote 7 doesn't make any sense. I don't know why that's there. I mean, it literally does nothing. It doesn't make, there's not one word in there that makes sense paired with the next or the previous. So the next portion of this article, it's also something I'm tempted to skip. This is a transcript meeting. It looks great. I mean, these colors look great together. Once again, we sort of have this neon coloration that would fit in kind of the paint job given to a child's action figure. That's kind of what these colors look like to me. So, I mean, I guess they work for some people. We have all these excessive footnotes that go into the credentials of these various researchers. But once again, this isn't characterization. It's just telling us they're the director of this, they're the director of that. I don't really know if they are necessary at all. They have some replay value once you understand what happens with the characters in this article. But once again, I think these footnotes are here just to add complexity to the article. I don't really think they do anything. I love this is not intentional on the author's part, but I love how this the first lines of this kind of throw shade at itself. It kind of shits on itself. It says, "Look, this whole summit is pointless." You know, so I wish I could take the character at their word and just skip all this. But, you know, like I said, I try to be a completionist. So having said that, we get through the interview. We're actually starting to get somewhere now that we have some characters talking. It's not just, it is still exposition dumping, but it's couched in, you know, it's couched in like actual characters and actual setting. And so it does something different. It's not much, but it's something. It's more than what we've gotten so far. So we read this and we find that it's an argument between the relevant researchers and the directors over things like funding and continued operations of what at least everybody here sort of agrees could be a waste of time. And so this reveals sort of the germ idea of the article in some ways, which is how to keep AI safe, combined with the exponential threat associated with an encroaching artificial intelligence sort of singularity. So there's some interesting conceptual play, and it's funny here that the researchers sort of self-fulfill the thing that they're trying to prevent, and their misguided, imperfect attempts of attaining and executing what they're trying to do as a good intention creates that undesired outcome. So that's something that I think is there. That's an interesting moment in the article. So I'm happy to see that created through these characters like this. There's also a little bit of enjoyable meta-critique in this when the researcher explains that the sort of artificial intelligence is trying to self-maximize by metrics of quantity. The parallels with the SCP writing culture, which is obsessed with upvotes, is unmistakable, but maybe that's just me. I don't know. So anyway, we wade through this transcript, and it just keeps going on. And once again, there are some interesting moments of sort of philosophical chewing on some concepts here, but these are people sitting in a room that are just talking to one another about the minutiae of this device. It's basically just talking about how complicated the device is. Again, it's basically just exposition. So this was very difficult for me to get through. It was like watching somebody in labor, pushing, and it's just hard to get through. The actors in this dialogue reference their own self-circularity a couple of times in this repetitive discussion. So it's tedious to get through. It's an uncomfortable reading experience. And by the end of it, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I'm actually overjoyed to see it interrupted by this, disembodied internal floating monologue thing in the documentation again. Once again, just to continue what I said last time we had one of these internal monologue things, the character seems to have abandoned any sort of fidelity in redirecting the reader's state of mind or holding the reader's hand, and instead it begins to turn very inwards. It sort of doubts itself here, false memories, and it sort of doubts its own reality. So, I wish I could see this as anything but the last flickerings of the guiding torch going out for this article, but that's how I see it. I just can't help it. So moving on, our digital guide here, our protagonist here, sort of alarms the AIC equivalent of a code red. And then the next addendum is the kind of cliche-ish system malfunction emergency shutdown maneuver thing, in which we see one of the characters here is Dr. Hishikaku refuses to shut off his baby, which is essentially the Lotus thing. And then we get this interesting, once again, another collapsible. It's a sub-incident log. That's something that I've never seen before. And so we open that and we get just, once again, a tremendous amount of exposition in the form of incidents. I think it's mostly filler, although, and where are we here? We are not halfway through the article, my God, help me. But we're a good chunk into the article, and we're actually just getting our first action of the whole article. This is the first time where something happens. So if you're watching a movie, this is the first time that anybody gets up in the movie. If you're driving down a road, this is the first building that you see on the drive. This is it. The first time something happens is in this sub-incident log. Everything else has been basically exposition. So there are some really nice passages in here that describe some very evocative scenes with compelling imagery, such as these spirals forming, the telephone call of scraping metal with the placeholder doctor. There's even cliches in this point, but by this time, I'm happy to see anything. The Morse code signals from the stars are kind of cliche, but I'm happy to see them because something is happening. And again, though, it is filled with meaningless technical specifications as a substitute for any other activity happening. I mean, you might as well take a textbook on electrical engineering or astronautical engineering, stick a grenade in it. That's basically what this looks like to me. None of it makes sense. The rare bits of activity that occur in this sub-incident log keep it from being really effective. Like, for example, the expanded technical details of this machine that we see over and over again. You know, the scuttle system, all this crap. And then, as expected, I knew it was going to happen at some point. We get actual author self-inserts. I think, who is it? Placeholder, I think, shows up in here. The actual place, yeah, here he is, placeholder McDoctorate. So, as expected, the authors can't resist to cross-reference, their self-inserts, along with these other article elements that they have featured in the admonition hub before, such as Dr. Placeholder here and his narrative injector machine thing from SCP-6747. When really this could be any other machine, but it has to be this one because it's self-referential, and these authors are trying to create a somewhat of a canon in this brand. And I'll say this, there's this sort of design by committee, like next celebrity guest up feel of admonition that in particular, and this is an explicit thing that's encouraged by the admonition hub's own nomenclature. It gives the entries sort of this inauthentic, segmented feel. The connections to past and future entries adopt this, this kind of like synthetic, this retroactive, this contrived, this best fit relationship. The illusions, like it is here, this Exodus engine and the cross links here, they seem interjected, and they seem like the article sort of bends towards them to satisfy this loose mandate for canonicity. So I don't think that works out very well. They also cross-reference other things, SCP-179. They also mention SCP-2000. These things sort of feel like stolen valor. The author's sort of throwing those in there because, hey, in the example of 2000, it's a K contest winner, X contest winner that has to do with science fiction. So let's put that in there. It even throws in here every other cliche immediately available to it, like including the "Does the Black Moon Howl?" Community favorite sort of line. It tries to follow this up. So what's happening here in this next sort of protagonist dialogue is that there's this sort of self-doubting, this sort of self-gaslighting sort of emergence happening here, and this comes out in the conversation. And so, as a way to sort of test the authenticity of our protagonist, the other individual in this discussion asks, "Does the Black Moon howl?" And of course, the cheesy response, "Only for the midnight sun." And it even tries to sort of one-up this, maybe follow it up with other such cringy lines of sort of live journal poetry. The emerald blade sings in the twilight. Dullahan calls its name. I mean, I'm sorry, but yuck. All right, yuck. That's just what that is. Okay, so we get through that. The next section is kind of a post-event analysis. Let's get through this. Basically, he checks out his own consciousness. It's fine. So basically, this little next section here is sort of a post-event analysis that tells us that rogue artificial intelligence activity has spiked and in a hostility as well after this Lotus machine was turned off. So somehow, and again, I believe the article is trying very hard to cheaply raise the stakes without really traversing the middle ground between points A and B, but somehow we arrive at the threat of a global nuclear war. So it's kind of like just throwing in the 05 there, just to kind of raise the stakes a bit. The next section is another conference with more actors sitting around and talking about technical specifications and containment possibilities. I'm not sure why footnote 11 exists. I mean, it's just useless detail that we don't need. But once again, sort of like a car that's kind of like lurching back and forth, we do actually get somewhere in this section. So once again, I'm very happy that something is happening, because once again, this is about 90% empty space. It's like an atom. It's just 90% filler, most of this exposition filling. But it's really the first thing that happens in this one since the sub incident log. So it's nice to see, some action happening besides these people sort of pseudo-philosophizing among themselves over, what amounts to remarkably uninteresting minutiae of sort of pseudo-science fiction. So once they get to the end here, basically something doesn't like the idea of this Lotus machine being restarted and lets these participants know that by essentially throwing the loudest synth club party ever. So it's a little, the intrigue is played well here because it actually tells us that something has been listening this whole time, which is not something that we knew. So that's a nice moment in this article, and I, once again, always appreciate it when something happens in this article. The next transcript continues by way of a random tape recorder that was found and engaged just so that the conference's words could be later dictated for some imaginary reader, I guess. But this is another crease from poor machining in the article structure. I mean, this antiquated tape recorder is just conveniently there, and they just conveniently find it, and then they just have the wherewithal to record it so that someone else later can write it down. Okay. So the entirety of this and this section as well is just way too long. It's dreadfully boring. It's tenaciously dull. The transcript here can be summarized in the 2-sentence afterword. That's really all that happens. So this is another meandering meeting that introduces our third pop culture pseudo-philosophy movie plot. And this time it is Inception. So the idea is introduced of a simulation within a simulation in this section. So it's like the other recycled ideas from the pop culture movies and video games. None of this is really being original. It's just kind of crudely grafted together pieces that were previously existing. And I think with a very severe lack of surgical skill, it's very easy to see these things sort of like how incongruous they are with themselves when they're sort of stuffed together in an effort to kind of get this plot going, much less somewhere. So the participants really discuss the epistemological state of the rogue artificial intelligences. The escalation here is scant. It seems as though delving into the details of how, a nuclear war was avoided might have been a better thing to focus on here, but that's sort of completely skipped over in favor of, again, watching the paint dry and the wallpaper peel with this highbrow group of people here. More than halfway into this section here, the information presented in the tidy 3 paragraphs of the addenda directly before us, before this one, is repeated. So that's not fun. Okay. We get more monologuing. We get more of this. I kind of feel like, once again, the afterwards almost could just stand in for the dialogue that happens here. It's not particularly bad dialogue. It's not particularly great dialogue either. Let me get to this part. Yeah. And so this next part is where a researcher's future self appears via the race no cannon, notifying them of a covert action of AI entities who are, going to do something bad. There's basically a rogue intelligence attack that's going to happen. And then this person who comes from the future lets himself or herself, whatever, know of this occurrence that's about to happen. Those of us who have read through this article at this point might wonder why this future traveler didn't convey a more important message. Like, for example, what happens by the end of the article. It seems like, or the deception that's going on, or why the protagonist or anyone else didn't use this device to warn of the nefarious scheme going on underneath the article and its characters here. There seems to be a couple of more things that might have been more important than just, warning somebody of these rogue AI instances. If there is, maybe I'm missing it, but it just seemed like a really, really bad reason to put this in there. Okay, so this portion, thankfully, is interrupted. I mean, it literally has a ... and falls off the cliff. not paying attention. It's almost like this portion was looking at its phone and didn't understand that it was walking off of the sidewalk and it fell off. But it was interrupted by our handy-dandy monologue section here. The protagonist recalls the data file for this group of interest that is talking about, which again is if you read the group of interest, is kind of taking cues from the Matrix almost verbatim, except essentially it is Morpheus and his crew, only now from the perspective of the dominant AI. So this kind of keeps going on. The protagonist sort of tries to, do this performance of a compelling sort of characters whose mental state is sort of dropping and fumbling over itself, and it sort of stumbles across the intended distance here and sort of just lands on this name. And this is the first instance of the article where the characterization is sort of mixed. It sort of starts to transform at this moment. But once again, it's just very forced. Like, for example, we get through all of this, yada, yada, yada. Somehow this group of interest kind of kickstarts some actual memories here. We get this sort of like bad acting sort of writing here where it's struggling with itself a little too exaggeratedly. And then basically the character play just drops in at the end. It really feels very forced. It really feels very unsmooth of a manner to bring in this guy. I'm pretty sure the authors could have found a more definitive reason for bringing up this character to kind of shine some questionable light onto them. Make the character be a little more integral to what's going on here than just this guy having something to do with it, and his name just happened to show up conveniently at the end of this section here. All right. Once again, we are at another conference transcript, and once again, the first lines of this unintentionally and hilariously sort of encapsulate the final words for this entire article, which is, "Let's get this over and done with. I'm sick of these damn summits." And the next person says, "I agree." So, at this point of the article, just to kind of take a breather here, because damn, this is a long article. I think that there are some interesting things going on. There's clearly some interesting concepts happening here. I don't think that they're very original. The characters, I think, are pretty interchangeable. I don't necessarily feel like there's strong personalities coming off from any one of them. But I think the biggest flaw of this article is that anything that it might have going for it in terms of the elements and ingredients that are in here, it's really spoiled by the pace. The pace is the absolutely worst part of this article. It's just a snail's pace. And it's the snail's pace of enterprise-level engineering projects. And so it's just doubly boring. It's just so unengaging of an article. The action and character interaction is stretched. It's so stretched over time and length of the actual article that it's very difficult to care by the time the authors, start to enact the twists in the characterization, such as in the meeting where the votes are overridden by the hierarchy structure. So that they can reactivate the Lotus, I think the 05 comes in. Yeah, so the orders are genuine. So basically all this somewhat tension created by what is there of the characters arguing with one another is sort of just rubber stamped by the 05 authority that comes in here too. It's a lot like just name dropping the 05. It's a lot like just saying that there's a nuclear war that's about to happen or something like that. It just seems very contrived. It just seems like this article doesn't really understand where it's going. I know it has an ending that it's trying to get to, but it just feels like it's like watching a mouse go through what should be a relatively straightforward maze, and it just keeps taking wrong turns that it has to sort of circle back. So this moment is supposed to have a high gravity where the 05 sort of come in and take the side of the person who's starting to be a little suspicious. But it's far from it, again, because of how shallow this article is due to its sheer surface area and how much of any given element has to be diluted and diffused across that's entire area. So it's just, unfortunately, a pivotal moment for the article. I think it's completely unmoving, and it's kind of a dud. It doesn't really do, I think, what the authors think it might do. Next section, the digital protagonist has by now sort of crepitated into pure exposition. So the little bit of characterization that we got in this individual, the little bit of a hand that we were offered to walk through the article with, in terms of like emotional investment or existential or perceptive sort of agreement or kinship, that's all sort of removed by this point. All that's whittled away, and basically we just have what we've had the whole article, which is exposition, only now it's in the voice of this character. So once again, that's basically, I would say 90-95% of this article is just lecture-like exposition to somebody. Okay. I hate to say it like this, but it spells out exactly what the reader is supposed to understand. So it's not even good exposition. And it almost seems like this has to happen because the actual storytelling here isn't capable of conveying this to the reader on its own merits. So of course, basically this person has to just sort of just exposition dump at this point, because that's the only way the article can do it. It can't do it through the narrative. It can't do it through the character interactions. It's doing it just in the most convenient way possible. I mean, this is one step up above a journal. That's really it. But even so, we do get a little bit of a reprieve from the summit transcripts, so I'm thankful for it. Our digital friend here is now frustrated because he has run into sort of credential blocks when attempting to access more information about this anomalies file, now that he's starting to sort of hone in a little bit more on what it actually might be. He still has the 05 credentials that shouldn't have expired, but that's still not working, and so as a fix, this protagonist dials a friend. What do you need, my friend? So he basically makes a case for why that access is needed to this file. The friend basically says that, you're kind of a lesser generation. I can point you towards the file director, to the lead researcher, which is this shady character who's starting to show up more and more. And the protagonist tries to make a case for himself because you don't want to have to report to this guy. That's kind of the problem here. So instead, the protagonist gets in touch with a technician, level 2 technician, and attempts to jog the technician's memory. When this fails, basically the protagonist orders the technician to take some amnestics, so basically directs them down to the apothecary and makes them take some drugs that help them remember some things that they clearly have been forced to forget. So the protagonist attempts to help the technician battle and win this mind war between the drug and the clearly embedded anti-meme. I think, once again, this is not very effective because of the characterization, or really the lack thereof. I mean, at this point, this is a new character. It's not really, if you've read the article, but as far as the read is concerned, this is a new character that has suddenly been sort of cast just to fulfill this role. So it doesn't really have a lot of the emotional investment that I think it could if we were dealing with more explicit characters that had been developed the whole time. And once again, that's kind of half true and half not true if you get to the twist at the end for the characters, but it's still true that we don't really have a lot of investment going on here with these characters at the same time. So it ends up being a little bit of a smirk moment for the authors who know who these characters are, but it still remains true that the characters are not sufficiently developed by this point, and so they're not really interesting either. I also think it's a little coincidental that these two people end up being who they end up being. And I can't say that the twist is very punchy or forceful due to the sheer amount of time that this whole article is drawn out over. Again, we get a ton of exposition to enact this twist to catch the reader up with what really has been happening. And another reason why the twist, I think, doesn't land is because something like this was contrived quite evidently and obviously all the way back in, let's say, the second containment procedures, when it talked about the Lotus constructing an artificial placation environment for anything under its control. So that sort of tipped us off, like something of this nature was probably going to happen. Something obviously wasn't going to be as it seems, and sort of there's a meta play with some of the framing devising going on here with regards to misdirection. So it's not really surprising to come across this, given what was basically winked and nudged to very poignantly, very, very strongly, very, very early on in the article there. Okay, so this is just very, very long. It keeps going. In the end, we kind of dovetail into the Church of the Broken God, and particularly the Maxwellists and things like Juan, who is mentioned explicitly. But again, sort of for all the time we've had exposition-wise, this feels a little shoehorned and a bit tacked on to the end. It's not really sufficiently developed, I think, for where it feels like a natural arrival for the story to sort of pop into. I mean, the genetics were there all along, right? I mean, this is artificial intelligence, and there's the Maxwellists right there, just down the shelf. But it just feels like it was grabbed at the last minute. It not really hinted towards ever, and it just feels a little bit abrupt of an inclusion right there. So and then once we get to the very end of this little section, we have more exposition. This, by the way, is where Juan is mentioned. This little fuzzy redaction, which I guess it's cool. Once again, it just is cool. It's cool for the sake of being cool. But we're back to other cross links to other admonition hubs that are used on to rely, or that are relied upon in order to deliver sort of the exposition here. So I think these references, the problem with using these things is that they clog up the reading. They clog up the delivery of any clean narrativic payload, because suddenly you have this road bump, this impediment in the delivery where it's like, okay, so now what is this? I have to go figure out what this is again, all this kind of stuff. So I think that any attempt at remaining in character for the format itself is abandoned by this last segment, which goes sort of full dangling keys mode into visual splendor. We have a rotating lotus sign that I have no fucking clue what is doing here. And even this section, which is freed dramatically from the shackles of clinical tone, is now still overly expository. It introduces more technobabble, such as the easily flingable hyper-reality right there. He attempts to process hyper-reality. What the fuck are you talking about? It's very clear at this point that the authors don't understand what they're writing down. It reads like a bad fanfic. Let me just read this. Victor is overwhelmed as his organic brain structures are exposed to Lotus's immense, ever-evolving complexity. That's kind of the article in a nutshell right there. It's just complexity equals profundity, apparently. He attempts to process hyper-reality, a level of detail beyond typical human perception, sufficient to deceive the most observant entities. So you're sort of Mary Sueing all of these components here. It goes on like this. I mean, this is just really not great writing. It feels like a middle schooler trying to be really, really profound in their characterization by making everything just completely overpowered. There's a lot of EM dash use in here that I don't think is very well done. I kind of, by this point, even want to be back in the Summit transcripts, because at least it wasn't ridiculous. It was just dull. This section makes it clear why so much investment goes into the visuals of this article. I don't think that description-based prose is the author's strong suit after reading a lot of these paragraphs in here. Let's see if we can find a decent example, just so that I don't sound like a fool without showing you something. Here's a section that I don't think is very well written at all. Victor scans over the continuing proofs and diagrams, desperately trying to find something, anything, that the superintelligence had somehow overlooked, a solution or an error, but Lotus's upgrade, there it is again, had granted it omniscience, knowing, understanding, and processing the entirety of reality, all at once, all the time. It was infallible. Okay, so, yikes. We are treated again to some incredibly beige philosophizing. Let's see. Here it is. Oh, this is a classic line. It talks about the cause creating the effect and the effect creating the cause, and like all this like caricature collegiate philosophizing that could it tries to tie back into the article's themes somehow, but I think at this point the article's themes are so nebulous and so diluted, so spread out over time and duration of this article that almost anything could sort of tie back into the themes here. It's just that non-specific to me. It's just that unfocused of an article with its themes. I think the word steamrolled is used here unironically. Victor jumps to avoid being steamrolled by Lotus. Yikes, man. And then what's really telling to me is the lack of any philosophical substance here is given an attempted steroid shot by the capitalization of just nouns, just random nouns. Effects, cause, manifests, deviant, contain, inaction, cause, whatever. I mean, yeah. It's just not good. It's just not good. This whole section is bad. I mean, it's a tale by this point. That's what I mean when I say it's basically just cast off any assumption of being in character, in genre, in universe. I don't really understand why this is. I think it tries to frame it earlier. Organic perceptive barriers detected, adjusting presentations. That's sort of a very, very thin, very frail attempt at justifying why suddenly we just delve into regally purple prose. There's one passage in here that I think it's probably some of the worst writing I've seen on the wiki in recent memory. The motionless white spider disappears. The proofs derived from this total sum of the entire unrestricted narrative space-time continuum. I mean, what the fuck does that mean, guys? Their findings irrefutable, inescapable, flash by. Should be an EM dash, but it's not. Flash by with increasing speed, matching the gray spider's increasing pace. I mean, it's just bad descriptive writing. It doesn't really put an image in your head. It's just all over the place. And this goes on and on and on. You're really only barely helped by the color treatment given to the text here. You can probably skip all of the cyan text and not miss a thing, which, is not a good thing. Not a good thing. The non-cyan text fails miserably for philosophical depth here as well. Let's actually get another example here just to show you. This is just really, really bad writing. This intelligence would, by some impossible yet certain means, be directly and personally responsible for all deviant behavior prior to its creation. The entity will have retroactively influenced lesser AI to instigate the very events that create it. I mean, I get what you're trying to say. I get that you're sort of like, it's like a bootstrap paradox kind of thing, or like an inevitability thing, one of the two or both. But it's just, the writing is so clunky. It's so hard to get through. It's like trying to choose something that's spiky. It's just like, it's difficult at every motion to get through all this stuff. There's an effort of, like I said, this causal kind of circularity. It brings to mind those repetitive scenes at the end of Doctor Strange. So basically, the same thing happens over and over and over again. The very first lines of this tale section are repeated again with the insinuation that this is a coda, and an inexhaustible coda that keeps repeating itself. And then, of course, we have like billions, it's probably trillions of iterations. I mean, so it's like that end of the Doctor Strange that just kind of gets stuck. It's not just the chronicity of this tale that's caught in a loop, but it's also the plot, the characterization, the exposition has finally come to sort of a, sort of the end of the exposition can't imagine itself dying, and so has this sort of repetitive sort of like cycling back upon itself thing. The direction is in a loop here. It's all hesitating perilously at the cliff of an ending that this article must now have, I mean, because it's been building up to this non-action this whole time. So we're finally given one of one. We're finally given a neutralized document at the very end. This is the real one, so we've been faked out twice, and that's supposed to be a good thing. So this is the real one. It wraps up all the errant directions in a bow, but it's not a nice bow. It's like that Christmas wrapper bow that only looks good if you don't look at it closely enough, that has tape all over it. Or it's like that gift, that Christmas gift wrapping that has tape all over the tears in the box, and whose entire backside is that comforting brown of an Amazon parcel that's just sort of situated to where you only see the front of the gift. What I mean by that is that, again, like the never-ending circularity and fractalization of the imagery in this article, and of the structure, and of the action, and of the characterization in this article, all of this in this final real document is repeated information. We've already learned these things. Nothing is new. They're all already known information, slightly packaged, slightly repackaged in just a slightly different spot. So at the very end, this is probably the worst part in my opinion. The very end, I think Dr. Placeholder, comes back in to clean up the mess, sort of like, hey, I can figure things out. He comes in and like solves a problem instantly that no one else could, or something like that. And of course, the last words of the article, the ultimate point of the article, the very tip of this is a name drop of the admonition hub. So that's how it ends. And so this was really, really bad. This is a very, very bad article. Philosophically, it rests very heavily on interests in things like artificial intelligence and computing, and sort of the philosophical directions you can take those things. For example, its germinative axiom is that an AI wants to complete its task as fast as possible, and gets to a point in this singularity process where that can't be stopped. And that actual phrase is repeated, word for word, as fast as possible, An AI wants to complete its task as fast as possible, at least 4 times in the article. I mean, even the most sophisticated philosophical portions of this article stick out like a sore thumb. I mean, it's just very poor manufacturing, very evident where the creases are, very evident where the weld marks are, where the suture lines are. It's not a lot of finesse in the structure and execution of this article. It's kind of grossly uneven. It's clunky machinery. If this were some origami, it would have creases where it shouldn't, and wrinkled tips that have been taped together. It's really, I think, if I had to guess, it's probably the author's attempt by trial and error to get the thing to look something like what they had in mind at the outset, all while trying to navigate references and inclusions like self-insert characters and past admonition hub articles. And quite honestly, it comes off as too many spinning plates for even the several authors that are involved in this to keep going. I think that the content and quality of this article, particularly its pacing, don't even remotely begin to justify its absolutely insane length. I think the authors will probably be cradled in a false sense of accomplishment by the number of upvotes that this is going to get. I think that most of that, having read the article twice, I would probably safely attribute to the successful and aggressive marketing campaign that this article underwent, and also its distracting CSS treatment. I think anybody with a framework of literary analysis and critique will quickly understand just how poor of an article this is. I honestly hope that this gets as many upvotes as possible, because maybe then the directors, the managers of these series of articles will maybe cool off on how hot they are trying to be and sort of settle back down into more grounded, more skillful writing. Because I know these people can be good. I've read works from each one of these individual people, and unfortunately somehow they've taken all of the elements from each one of these peoples and made everybody's strengths as an author worse by putting them together into this. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of typical of admonition. It's it calls itself deep, but at heart it's very polite pop article stuff that sort of gives itself the self-awarded moniker of being high concept. There's really nothing so amazing or deep about it that it lingers with you after you're done reading it, in my opinion. Derivative stuff like this is not really hurting anybody. It certainly looks good. It's exciting, I'm sure, for a lot of people who are confused about what might be happening here. And I got to say, I even went into this with a positive mindset because, I do admire portions of 6747. And once again, the read of Placeholders 001 sort of blew my mind at the end. It sort of shut me up when I was talking a bunch of smack about it. But I'd say in this offering, the authors have completely overextended themselves entirely too much, despite all of its rage and its good looks and its flashiness and its varied presentations. This is really a one-dimensional, one-note article. It's aneurysmal to get through. I can't imagine reading this again. It's flashy, it's winding, it's got stuffy dialogue. It routinely enacts irredeemable conceptual decisions. It's low energy and sleepy, while trying to come off as too cerebral, too brainy, overly complicated, and desperately elaborate. This article is sort of the containment fiction equivalent of the sleepy NPR voice that's trying to tell you something but that basically is just a really good way to go to sleep. A lot of these transcripts kind of come off as like noise passages with just tons of filler. There is entirely too much exposition in this article. It tangles over itself. It doesn't really move gracefully. It doesn't get to where it wants to go very gracefully. The plot is all over the place. The themes here pretend to be focused on intellectual pursuits, but they do so in name only, really counting on the subject matter to do the heavy lifting. Not much is done with it. And again, the characters are sort of bland and interchangeable. It kind of reminds me of the Marvel universe, the MCU, which didn't really have a holistic outline either. And so we don't really have a story so much as we have a series of retcons and unresolved foreshadowings, because each article, particularly if you want to look at the Admonition Hub as a whole, each author in this article, each article in the Admonition Hub is hopelessly its own thing. At most has a checklist of what characters need to be used and have basically a common thread of just having a consistent tone and a visual style. So, I mean, it's quite honestly a miserable read. It tries way too hard. I don't know what else to say about this. Feels like a nomenclature class. I think that almost everything in this article is a compositional misstep aimed exclusively at sending the impression of being more intelligent and substantive than it actually is. It has an oversaturation of cross-links and dependency on other articles. I kind of lost faith in the cross-links and kind of gave up. And once again, I mean, I'm not sure about the fake-outs. The fake-outs of the fake documentation I don't think do a whole bunch. It seems like there's just numerous hemispheres, maybe two, of this article that don't really connect with one another. They're not really speaking to one another. That whole two-step treatment that we saw with the fake documentation a couple times, it sort of happens with everything. It's the characters, it's the setting, it's the anomaly, it's the file. It's a file, but it's not a file. It's a rogue system of AI, but it's not, but it is. And the characters are at odds, but they're united, but they're not at the end. The protagonist is supposed to be somebody that the O5 Council trusts, but then it turns out that it's nobody, but then the twist is that it is somebody. All that really happened in this article is an exchange between a super overpowered bad guy with a super overpowered Mary Sue AI containment cell back into the overpowered 682 monster scenario. And then it goes back into a Mary Sue force for good, but then it becomes an unstoppable, omniscient force of calculating indifference. It's sort of this shaking baby treatment of the reader that constitutes a majority of the action in this article. I don't think it actually does a whole lot. When finally introduced, the action that is in this article, like in that sub incident event, a lot of it is sticking together other things. SCP-2000, other crosslinks to Admonition Hub, and even the larger themes do this. It's just other things that are stuck together. You've got The Matrix, you've got Detroit Become Human, you've got Inception, you've got something like iRobot in there as well. These things are decades old. They're not really new. And I think the execution of them, especially in these summit transcripts here, are so blandly delivered that even the most obsessive and attentive and hyped up readers are bound to have their brains gloss over at least once, sort of requiring them to go back and ask what they just read. It seems to have no sense of self-awareness when it comes to the length of this article. It moves at a complete tortoise pace and is about as exciting as a tortoise. Most of this article is lacking in any narrativic or conceptual momentum. Most of the material is so non-advancing for most of the time. The addendas get stale quickly due to a lack of action and the one-note play of smart people debating big things. It's just a huge, dense, tangled mess of an article, in my opinion. It's just so flatly delivered. It's an endless string of impassionate dialogue that gets really, really old, really, really fast, dragging the article out unnecessarily. And then once again, the twist at the end is kind of a total non-factor because we've been unable to engage with these people as characters as anything other than enigmatic, removed, academic, and too intelligent for you sort of archetypes. There's no connection point for the reader. There's nothing stand out. The only thing high concept about this work is the amount of weed needed to write it and think that it's deep. There's not so much lasting thought here as fleeting scenes. It felt like staring at the wall during an exceptionally long church service. I think the authors, they're trying way too hard. They're not delivering at the level that someone at this sort of visibility on the wiki should be, and certainly not with this sort of hype marketing campaign. Really, really did not meet the moment, given how much aggression and how much hype was generated through social media marketing for this. It's just a tremendously disappointing article. I'd give the visuals a 10 out of 10. I'd give the writing a 1 out of 10. So, this is supposed to be a writing site. It's not supposed to be Netflix. So I'm going to go with the 1 out of 10. So that took a long time. I wonder how long we've been doing this. Is anybody still with me? Yeah, there's one. God damn. You need a raise or something. I don't know what you're doing. Are you me? I don't know. Yeah, we've been going almost 4 hours, but I just felt like I needed to get through that. I got to tell you why I think this article is so bad. And there's some sort of incentive in me that says, to the extent that this thing is being celebrated and popular, it's not to say that that's how much I want to bash it down. It's just that that's how eager I am to explain why it is that I think this is incredibly, incredibly overrated when it comes to upvotes. I think that this is once again mostly flavor pack and not a lot of ramen at all. If you wanted to compare this to the other one that we did earlier, that one by Storm Breath, I mean, the one by Storm Breath is it's not even fair. It's not fair to compare the two. It's like it's black and white, night and day. There's not even a portion of that compositional talent in this. What this article really has going for it are its visuals, and it's highly technical, very smooth, very crisp, clinical tone. But what is done with those elements is rather disappointing. So I mean, this is an incredibly long article. I can't recommend it. You know, it was quite painful to read numerous times, to be honest with you. I never want to see this article again. This is a bad article for sure. All right. Well, that has been a very, very special week of our show. 4 hours. I thought it was going to be shorter, but it actually is longer than usual. But thank you so much for joining, and I really hope you enjoyed this, got something out of it. We will do it again. We'll be back next week. WikiDot is supposed to come back on Monday, so we'll pick it up right there. We'll start hitting articles, and we'll be ready this time next week. I do want to encourage you to join us for our tomorrow show. That's Saturday, 11 a.m. CST. That is SCP Meta. And that's sort of, if this is business, because that's what we're doing here, very business, and the reaction streams are casual, then our show tomorrow is SCP Meta. It's sort of business casual. It's sort of in the middle. We can kind of hang out, but we try to get down to some business for sure. And so we'll talk about things that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet on that show, such as Dr. Bright, what happened with Dr. Bright, WikiDot going down. So I do hope you will join us, encourage you to join us at that point. We do have, of course, a live phone number at that time. We take any call that comes our way, whether it be criticism, trolling, a comment, a question. Hopefully as long as it's about containment fiction. This is supposed to be sort of a people's talk show where you can call in and let your voice be heard. It really is supposed to be the platform dedicated to having a variety of opinions and thoughts on there, excuse me, with no real privileged position taking center stage. Anyway, that was quite an exhausting stream, but I do appreciate you sticking in here with me. And we'll see. I hope to God the wiki comes up. RIP to everybody whose self-esteem is based on the SCP Wiki. Kind of going the way of Vine celebrities. Just watch out. I just now noticed that this has the paper thing behind it too. That's pretty cool. I'll give it that. These divs. Okay. Anyways, appreciate it. This has been SCP-CRNP, aka Lack of Lepers, the most dedicated and hated critic of the SCP Wiki, and the hardest working man in containment fiction. So I will see you next time. Hope you have a great week. I want to remind you one more time that I'm going on vacation next week, so we won't have any of our reaction nights next week. I'm going out of town Monday through, I guess, Friday. So what we'll do is Friday night show a week from now. We'll do this for the SCP articles for next week, and then we'll pick it up from there. So it'll be a while. Check it out tomorrow for SCP Meta. Otherwise, I'll see you later. Thanks again. Appreciate it. Peace.